Stories of Futures Past presents 8 stories featuring women writers, Volume 2. All Cats Are Grey by Norton. Homesick by Marilyn. Venable. No Pets Allowed by Monette. Cummings. The Margenes by Miriam DeFord. The Doorway by Evelyn Smith. The Stroller by Margaret Clair. Green Grew the Lasses by Ruth Wainwright. The Wind People by Marion Zimmer Bradley. All Cats Are Grey by Norton, writing as Andrew North. Originally published in Fantastic Universe Science Fiction, August 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Under normal conditions, a whole person has a decided advantage over a handicapped one, but out in deep space the normal may be reversed, for humans at any rate. Stina of the Space Waves. That sounds just like a corny title for one of the Stellar Veto spreads. I ought to know. I've tried my hand at writing enough of them. Only this Stina was no glamour babe. She was as colourless as a lunar plant. Even the hair netted down to her skull had a sort of greyish cast, and I never saw her but once draped in anything but a shapeless and baggy grey space-all. Stina was strictly background stuff, and that is where she mostly spent her free hours, in the smelly, smoky background corners of any stellar port dive frequented by free spacers. If you really looked for her, you could spot her, just sitting there listening to the talk, listening and remembering. She didn't open her own mouth often, but when she did, spacers had learned to listen, and the lucky few who heard her rare spoken words, these will never forget Stina. She drifted from port to port. Being an expert operator on the big calculators, she found jobs wherever she cared to stay for a time. And she came to be something like the master-minded machines she tended, smooth, grey, without much personality of her own. But it was Stina who told Bub Nelson about the Jovan moonrights, and her warning saved Bub's life 6 months later. It was Stina who identified the piece of stone Keene Clark was passing around a table one night, rightly calling it unworked slitite. That started a rush which made 10 fortunes overnight for men who were down on their last jets. And last of all, she cracked the case of the Empress of Mars. All the boys who had profited by her queer store of knowledge and her photographic memory tried at one time or another to balance the scales, but she wouldn't take so much as a cup of cannel water at their expense, let alone the credits they tried to push on her. Bub Nelson was the only one who got around her refusal. It was he who brought her Bat. About a year after the Jovan affair, he walked into the free fall one night and dumped Bat down on a table. Bat looked at Stina and growled. She looked calmly back at him and nodded once. From then on, they travelled together, the thin grey woman and the big grey tomcat. Bat learned to know the inside of more stellar bars than even most spacers visit in their lifetime. He developed a liking for vernal juice, drank it neat and quick, right out of a glass, and he was always at home on any table where Stina elected to drop him. This is really the story of Stina, Bat, Cliff Moran, and the Empress of Mars, a story which is already a legend of the spaceways, and it's a damn good story too. I ought to know, having framed the first version of it myself. For I was there, right in the Rigel Royal, when it all began on the night that Cliff Moran blew in, looking lower than an ant-man's belly and twice as nasty. He'd had a spell of luck foul enough to twist a man into a slug snake, and we all knew that there was an attachment out for his ship. Cliff had fought his way up from the back courts of Venaport. Lost his ship, and he'd slip back there, to rot. He was at the snarling stage that night when he picked out a table for himself and set out to drink away his troubles. However, just as the first bottle arrived, so did a visitor. Stina came out of her corner, bat curled around her shoulders, stole-wise, his favourite mode of travel. She crossed over and dropped down without invitation at Cliff's side. That shook him out of his sulks, because Stina never chose company when she could be alone. If one of the manstones of Ganymede had come stumping in, it wouldn't have made more of us look out of the corners of her eyes. She stretched out one long-fingered hand and set aside the bottle he had ordered and said only one thing. "It's about time for the Empress of Mars to appear again." Cliff scowled and bit his lip. It was tough as jet lining. You have to be granite inside and out to struggle up from Venable to a ship command. But we could guess what was running through his mind at that moment. The Empress of Mars was just about the biggest prize a spacer could aim for. But in the 50 years she had been following her queer derelict orbit through space, many men had tried to bring her in, and none had succeeded. A pleasure ship carrying untold wealth, she had been mysteriously abandoned in space by passengers and crew, none of whom had ever been seen or heard of again. At intervals thereafter she had been sighted, even boarded. Those who ventured into her either vanished or returned swiftly without any believable explanation of what they had seen, wanting only to get away from her as quickly as possible. But the man who could bring her in, or even strip her clean in space, that man would win the jackpot. "All right," Cliff slammed his fist down on the table. "I'll try even that." Stina looked at him, much as he must have looked at Bat the day Bub Nelson brought him to her, and nodded. That was all I saw. The rest of the story came to me in pieces, months later, and in another port half the system away. Cliff took off that night. He was afraid to risk waiting, with a writ out that could pull the ship from under him, and it wasn't until he was in space that he discovered his passengers, Stina and Bat. We'll never know what happened then. I'm betting that Stina made no explanation at all. She wouldn't. It was the first time she had decided to cash in on her own tip, and she was there. That was all. Maybe that point weighed with Cliff. Maybe he just didn't care. Anyway, the three were together when they sighted the Empress riding, her dead lights gleaming, a ghost ship in night space. She must have been an eerie sight, because her other lights were on too, in addition to the red warnings at her nose. She seemed alive, a flying Dutchman of space. Cliff worked his ship skillfully alongside and had no trouble in snapping magnetic lines to her lock. Some minutes later, the three of them passed into her. There was still air in her cabins and corridors, air that bore a faint, corrupt taint which set Bat to sniffing greedily and could be picked up even by the less sensitive human nostrils. Cliff headed straight for the control cabin, but Stina and Bat went prowling. Closed doors were a challenge to both of them, and Stina opened each as she passed, taking a quick look at what lay within. The fifth door opened on a room which no woman could leave without further investigation. I don't know who had been housed there when the Empress left port on her last lengthy cruise. Anyone really curious can check back on the old photo reg cards. But there was a lavish display of silks trailing out of 2 travel kits on the floor, a dressing table crowded with crystal and jewelled containers, along with other lures for the female which drew Stina in. She was standing in front of the dressing table when she glanced into the mirror, glanced into it and froze. Over her right shoulder she could see the spider silk cover on the bed. Right in the middle of that sheer, gossamer expanse was a sparkling heap of gems, the dumped contents of some jewel case. Bat had jumped to the foot of the bed and flattened out as cats will, watching those gems, watching them, and something else. Stina put out her hand blindly and caught up the nearest bottle. As she unstoppered it, she watched the mirrored bed. A gemmed bracelet rose from the pile, rose in the air and tinkled its siren song. It was as if an idle hand played. Bat spat almost noiselessly, but he did not retreat. Bat had not yet decided his course. She put down the bottle. Then she did something which perhaps few of the men she had listened to through the years could have done. She moved without hurry or sign of disturbance on a tour about the room, and although she approached the bed, she did not touch the jewels. She could not force herself to that. It took her 5 minutes to play out her innocence and unconcern. Then it was Bat who decided the issue. He leapt from the bed and escorted something to the door, remaining a careful distance behind. Then he mewed loudly twice. Stina followed him and opened the door wider. Bat went straight on down the corridor, as intent as a hound on the warmest of scents. Stina strolled behind him, holding her place to the unhurried gait of an explorer. What sped before them both was invisible to her, but Bat was never baffled by it. They must have gone into the control cabin almost on the heels of the unseen. If the unseen had heels, which there was good reason to doubt, for Bat crouched just within the doorway and refused to move on. Stina looked down the length of the instrument panels and officers' station seats to where Cliff Moran worked. On the heavy carpet her boots made no sound, and he did not glance up, but sat humming through set teeth as he tested the tardy and reluctant responses to buttons which had not been pushed in years. To human eyes they were alone in the cabin, but Bat still followed a moving something with his gaze, and it was something which he had at last made up his mind to distrust and dislike, for now he took a step or two forward and spat, his loathing made plain by every raised hair along his spine. And in that same moment Stina saw a flicker of vague outline against Cliff's hunched shoulders, as if the invisible one had crossed the space between them. But why had it been revealed against Cliff, and not against the back of one of the seats, or against the panels, the walls of the corridor, or the cover of the bed where it had reclined and played with its lute? What could Bat see? The storehouse memory that had served Stina so well throughout the years clicked open a half-forgotten door. With one swift motion she tore loose her space-all and flung the baggy garment across the back of the nearest seat. Bat was snarling now, emitting the throaty rising cry that was his hunting song. But he was edging back towards Stina's feet, shrinking from something he could not fight, but which he faced defiantly. If he could draw it after him, past that dangling space-all, he had to. It was their only chance. "What the?" Cliff had come out of his seat and was staring at them. What he saw must have been weird enough. Stina, bare-armed and shouldered, her usually stiffly netted hair falling wildly down her back. Stina watching empty space with narrowed eyes and set mouth, calculating a single wild chance. Bat, crouched on his belly, retreating from thin air step by step and wailing like a demon. "Toss me your blaster." Stina gave the order calmly, as if they still sat at their table in the Rigel Royal. And as quietly Cliff obeyed. She caught the small weapon out of the air with a steady hand, caught and levelled it. "Stay just where you are," she warned. "Back, Bat, bring it back." With a last throat-splitting screech of rage and hate, Bat twisted to safety between her boots. She pressed with thumb and forefinger, firing at the space-alls. The material turned to powdery flakes of ash, except for certain bits which still flapped from the scorched seat, as if something had protected them from the force of the blast. Bat sprang straight up in the air with a scream that tore their ears. "What?" began Cliff again. Stina made a warning motion with her left hand. "Wait!" She was still tense, still watching Bat. The cat dashed madly around the cabin twice, running crazily with white ringed eyes and flecks of foam on his muzzle. Then he stopped abruptly in the doorway, stopped and looked back over his shoulder for a long silent moment. He sniffed delicately. Stina and Cliff could smell it too now, a thick, oily stench, which was not the usual odour left by an exploding blaster shell. Bat came back, treading daintily across the carpet, almost on the tips of his paws. He raised his head as he passed Stina, and then he went confidently beyond to sniff, to sniff and spit twice at the unburned strips of the space hull. Having thus paid his respects to the late enemy, he sat down calmly and set to washing his fur with deliberation. Stina sighed once and dropped into the navigator's seat. "Maybe now you'll tell me what in the hell happened?" Cliff exploded as he took the blaster out of her hand. "Grey," she said dazedly. "It must have been grey, or I couldn't have seen it like that. I'm colourblind, you see. I can see only shades of grey. My whole world is grey. Like Bat's, his world is grey too. All grey. But he's been compensated for. He can see above and below our range of colour vibrations, and, apparently, so can I." Her voice quavered, and she raised her chin with a new air Cliff had never seen before, a sort of proud acceptance. She pushed back her wandering hair, but she made no move to imprison it under the heavy net again. "That is why I saw the thing when it crossed between us. Against your space hull it was another shade of grey, an outline. So I put out mine and waited for it to show against that. It was our only chance, Cliff. It was curious at first, I think, and it knew we couldn't see it, which is why it waited to attack. But when Bat's actions gave it away, it moved. So I waited to see that flicker against the space hull, and then I let him have it. It's really very simple." Cliff laughed a bit shakily. "But what was this grey thing? I don't get it." "I think it was what made the Empress a derelict. Something out of space, maybe, or from another world somewhere." She waved her hands. "It's invisible because it's a colour beyond our range of sight. It must have stayed in here all these years, and it kills. It must, when its curiosity is satisfied." Swiftly she described the scene in the cabin, and with the strange behaviour of the gem pile which had betrayed the creature to her. Cliff did not return his blaster to his holster. "Any more of them on board, do you think?" He didn't look pleased at the prospect. Stina turned to Bat. He was paying particular attention to the space between two front toes in the process of a complete bath. "I don't think so, but Bat will tell us if there are. He can see them clearly, I believe." But there weren't any more, and 2 weeks later, Cliff, Stina, and Bat brought the Empress into the lunar quarantine station. And that is the end of Stina's story, because, as we have been told, happy marriages need no chronicles. And Stina had found someone who knew of her grey world and did not find it too hard to share with her, someone besides Bat. It turned out to be a real love match. The last time I saw her, she was wrapped in a flame-red cloak from the looms of Rigel and wore a fortune in Jovan rubies blazing on her wrists. Cliff was flipping a 3-figure credit bill to a waiter, and Bat had a row of Vernal juice glasses set up before him. Just a little family party out on the town. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Homesick by Marilyn Venable, writing as Lynn Venable. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, December 1952. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Frankston pushed listlessly at a red checker with his right forefinger. He knew the move would cost him a man, but he lacked enough interest in the game to plot out a safe move. His opponent, James, jumped the red disc with a black king and removed it from the board. Gregory, across the room, flicked rapidly through the pages of a magazine, too rapidly to be reading anything or even looking at the pictures. Ross lay quietly on his bunk, staring out of the viewport. The four were strangely alike in appearance, nearly the same age, the age where grey hairs finally outnumber black, or baldness takes over. The age when the expanding waistline has begun to sag tiredly, when robust middle age begins the slow accelerating decline towards senility. A strange group to find aboard a spaceship. But then the Columbus was a very strange ship. Bolted to its outer hull, just under the viewports, were wooden boxes full of red geraniums, and ivy wound tenuous green fronds over the gleaming hull that had withstood the bombardment of pinpoint meteors and turned away the deadly power of naked cosmic rays. Frankston glanced at his wrist chrono. It was 1 minute to 6. In about a minute, he thought, Ross will say something about going out to water his geraniums. The wrist chrono ticked 59 times. "I think I'll go out and water my geraniums," said Ross. No one glanced up. Then Gregory threw his magazine on the floor. Ross got up and walked, limping slightly, to a wall locker. He pulled out the heavy, ungainly spacesuit and the big metal bulb of a headpiece. He carried them to his bunk and laid them carefully down. "Will somebody please help me on with my suit?" he asked. For one more long moment no one moved. Then James got up and began to help Ross fit his legs into the suit. Ross had arthritis, not badly, but enough so that he needed a little help climbing into a spacesuit. James pulled the heavy folds of the suit up around Ross's body and held it while Ross extended his arms into the sleeve sections. His hands, in the heavy gauntlets, were too unwieldy to do the front fastenings, and he stood silently while James did it for him. Ross lifted the helmet, staring at it as a cripple might regard a wheelchair which he loathed, but was wholly dependent upon. Then he fitted the helmet over his head, and James fastened it down, and lifted the oxygen tank to his back. "Ready?" asked James. The bulbous headpiece inclined in a nod. James walked to a panel and threw a switch marked Inner Lock. A round aperture slid silently open. Ross stepped through it, and the door shut behind him as James threw the switch back to its original position. Opposite the switch marked Outer Lock, a signal glowed redly, and James threw another switch. A moment later, the signal flickered out. Frankston, with a violent gesture, swept the checkerboard clean. Red and black men clattered to the floor, rolling and spinning. Nobody picked them up. "What does it do it for?" demanded Frankston in a tight voice. "What does he get out of those stinking geraniums he can't touch or smell?" "Shut up," said Gregory. James looked up sharply. Curtness was unusual for Gregory, a bad sign. Frankston was the one he'd been watching, the one who'd shown signs of cracking, but after so long, even a psycho-expert's opinion might be haywire. Who was a yardstick? Who was normal? "Geraniums don't smell much anyway," added Gregory in a more conciliatory tone. "Yeah," agreed Frankston. "I'd forgotten that. But why does he torture himself like this, and us too?" "Because that's what he wanted to do," answered James. "Sure," agreed Gregory. "The whole trip, the last 20 years of it, anyhow, all he could talk about was how, when he got back to Earth, he was going to buy a little place in the country and raise flowers." "Well, we're back," muttered Frankston with a terrible bitterness. "He's raising flowers, but not in any little place in the country." Gregory continued almost dreamily. "Remember the last night out? We were all gathered around the view screen, and there was Earth, getting bigger and greener and closer all the time. Remember what it felt like to be going back after 30 years? 30 years cooped up in this ship," grumbled Frankston. "All our 20s and 30s and 40s. "But we were coming home." There was a rapt expression on Gregory's lined and weathered face. "We were looking forward to the 20 or maybe 30 good years we had left, talking about what we'd do, where we'd live, wondering what had changed on Earth. At least we had that last night out. All the data was stashed away in the microfiles, all the data about planets with air we couldn't breathe and food we couldn't eat. We were going home, home to big, friendly, green Earth." Frankston's face suddenly crumpled, as though he were about to weep, and he cradled his head against his arms. "God, do we have to go over it all again? Not again tonight." "Leave him alone," ordered James with an inflection of command in his voice. Go to the other section of the ship if you don't want to listen. He has to keep going over it, just like Ross has to keep watering his geraniums." Frankston remained motionless, and Gregory looked gratefully at James. James was the steady one. It was easier for him because he understood. Gregory's face became more and more animated as he lost himself, living again his recollections. The day we blasted in, the crowds, thousands of people, all there to see us come in. We were proud. Of course, we thought we were the first to land, just like we'd been the first to go out. Those cheers, coming from thousands of people at once. For us, Ross, Lieutenant Ross, was the first one out of the lock. We decided on that. He'd been in command for almost 10 years, ever since Commander Stevens died. You remember Stevens, don't you? He took over when we lost Captain Willers. Well, anyway, Ross out first, and then you, James, and you, Frankston, and then Trippitt, and me last because you were all specialists and I was just a crewman. The crewman, I should say, the only one left. Ross hesitated and almost stumbled when he stepped out, and tears began pouring from his eyes. But I thought, well, you know, coming home after 30 years and all that. But when I stepped out of the lock, my eyes stung like fire, and 1,000 needles seemed to jab at my skin. And then the President himself stepped forward with the flowers. That's where the real trouble began, with the flowers. I remember Ross stretching out his arms to take the bouquet, like a mother reaching for a baby. And then suddenly he dropped them, sneezing and coughing and sobbing for breath. And the President reached out to help him, asking him over and over what was wrong. It was the same with all of us, and we turned and staggered back to the ship, closing the lock behind us. It was bad then. God, I'll never forget it. The 5 of us, moaning in agony, gasping for breath, our eyes all swollen shut, and the itching. That itching, Gregory shuddered. Even the emotionally disciplined James set his teeth and felt his scalp crawl at the memory of that horror. He glanced toward the viewport, as though to cleanse his mind of the memory. He could see Ross out there, among the geraniums, moving slowly and painfully in his heavy spacesuit. Occupational therapy. Ross watered flowers, and Gregory talked, and Frankston was bitter, and himself? Observation, maybe. Gregory's voice began again. And then they were pounding on the lock, begging us to let the doctor in, but we were all rolling and thrashing with the itching, burning, sneezing, and finally James got himself under control enough to open the locks and let them in. Then came the tests, allergy tests. Remember those? They'd cut a little row of scratches in your arm. Each man instinctively glanced at his forearm, saw neat rows of tiny pink scars, row on row. Then they'd put a little powder in each cut, and each kind of powder was an extract of some common substance we might be allergic to. The charts they made were full of P's for positive, long columns of big red P's. All pollen, dust, wool, nylon, cotton, fish, meat, fruit, vegetables, grain, milk, whiskey, cigarettes, dogs, cats, everything. And wasn't it funny about us being allergic to women's face powder? Ha! We were allergic to women from the nylon hose to their face powder. 30 years of breathing purified, sterilized, filtered air, 30 years of drinking distilled water and swallowing synthetic food tablets had changed us. The only things we weren't allergic to were the metal and plastic and synthetics of our ship, this ship. We were allergic to Earth. That's funny, isn't it? Gregory began to rock back and forth, laughing the thin, high laugh of hysteria. James silently walked to a water hydrant and filled a plastic cup. He brought Gregory a small white pill. You wouldn't take this with the rest of us at supper. You'd better take it now. You need it. Gregory nodded bleakly, sobering at once, and swallowed the pellet. He made a face after the water. Distilled, he spat. Distilled. No flavour, no life. Like us, distilled. If only we could have blasted off again. Frankston's voice came muffled through his hands. It wouldn't have made any difference where, anywhere or nowhere. No, our fine ship is obsolete, and we're old, much too old. They have the space drive now. Men don't make 30 years junkets into space and come back allergic to Earth. They go out, and in a month or two they're back, with their hair still black, and their eyes still bright, and their uniforms still fit. A month or two is all. Those crowds that cheered us, they were proud of us and sorry for us, because we'd been out 30 years, and they never expected us back at all. But it was inconvenient for Spaceport. Bitter sarcasm tinged his voice. They actually had to postpone the regular monthly transgalactic run to let us in with this big, clumsy hulk. Why didn't we ever see any of the new ships either going out or coming back? Asked Gregory. Frankston shook his head. You don't see a ship when it's in space drive. It's out of normal space-time dimensions. We had a smattering of the theory at cadet school. Anyway, if one did flash into normal space-time, say, for instance, coming in for landing, the probability of us being at the same place at the same time was almost nil. 2 ships passing in the night, as the old saying goes. Gregory nodded. I guess Trippitt was a lucky one. You didn't see Trippitt die, replied James. What was it? Asked Frankston. What killed Trippitt? So quickly, too. He was only outside a few minutes like the rest of us, and 8 hours later he was dead. We couldn't be sure, answered James. Some virus. There are countless varieties. People live in a contaminated atmosphere all their lives, build up a resistance to them. Sometimes a particularly virulent strain will produce an epidemic, but most people, if they're affected, will have a mild case of whatever it is and recover. But after 30 years in space, 30 years of breathing perfectly pure, uncontaminated air, Trippitt had no antibodies in his bloodstream. The virus hit, and he died. But why didn't the rest of us get it? Asked Gregory. We were lucky. Viruses are like that. Those people talked about building a home for us, muttered Frankston. Why didn't they? It wouldn't have been any different, answered James gently. It would have been the same, almost an exact duplicate of the ship. Everything but the rockets, same metal and plastic and filtered air and synthetic food. It couldn't have had wool rugs or down pillows or smiling wives or fresh air or eggs for breakfast. It would have been just like this. So since the ship was obsolete, they gave it to us, and a plot of ground to anchor it to, and we're home. They did the best they could for us, the very best they could. But I feel stifled, shut in. The ship is large, Frankston. We all crowd into this section because, without each other, we'd go mad. James kicked the edge of the magazine on the floor. Thank God we're not allergic to decontaminated paper. They're still reading. We're getting old, said Gregory. Some day one of us will be here alone. God help him then, answered James, with more emotion than was usual for him. During the latter part of the conversation, the little red signal had been flashing persistently. Finally James saw it. Ross was in the outer lock. James threw the decontaminator switch, and the signal winked out. Every trace of dust and pollen would have to be removed from Ross's suit before he could come inside the ship. Just like on an alien planet, commented Gregory. Isn't that what this is to us? An alien planet? Asked Frankston, and neither of the other men dared answer his bitter question. A few minutes later, Ross was back in the cabin, and James helped him out of his spacesuit. "How are the geraniums, Ross?" asked Gregory. "Fine," said Ross enthusiastically. "They're doing just fine." He walked over to his bunk and laid down on his side so he could see out of the viewport. There would be an hour left before darkness fell. An hour to watch the geraniums. They were tall and red, and swayed slightly in the evening breeze. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. No Pets Allowed by Monette Cummings, writing as M.A. Cummings. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, August 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. I can't tell anyone about it. In the first place, they'd never believe me, and if they did, I'd probably be punished for having her, because we aren't allowed to have pets of any kind. It wouldn't have happened if they hadn't sent me way out there to work, but you see, there are so many things I can't do. I remember the day the chief of vocation took me before the council. "I tried him on a dozen things," he reported. People always talk about me as if I can't understand what they mean, but I'm really not that dumb. "There doesn't seem to be a thing he can do," the chief went on. "Actually, his intelligence seems to be no greater than that which we believed our ancestors had back in the 20th century. "As bad as that?" observed one of the council members. "You do have a problem." "But we must find something for him to do," said another. "We can't have an idle person in this state. It's unthinkable." "But what?" asked the chief. "He's utterly incapable of running any of the machines. I've tried to teach him. The only things he can do are already being done much better by robots." There was a long silence, broken at last by one little old council member. "I have it," he cried. "The very thing. We'll make him guard of the treasure." "But there's no need of a guard. No one will touch the treasure without permission. We haven't had a dishonest person in the state for more than 3,000 years. "That's it, exactly. There aren't any dishonest people, so there won't be anything for him to do. But we will have solved the problem of his idleness." "It might be a solution," said the chief. "At least, a temporary one. I suppose we'll have to find something else later on, but this will give us time to look for something." So I became guard of the treasure, with a badge, and nothing to do, unless you count watching the key. The gates were kept locked, just as they were in the old days, but the large key hung beside them. Of course, no one wanted to bother carrying it around. It was too heavy. The only ones who ever used it, anyway, were members of the council. As the man said, we haven't had a dishonest person in the state for thousands of years. Even I know that much. Of course, this left me with lots of time on my hands. That's how I happened to get her in the first place. I'd always wanted one, but pets were forbidden. Busy people didn't have time for them, so I knew I was breaking the law. But I figured that no one would ever find out. First I fixed a place for her and made a brush screen so that she couldn't be seen by anyone coming to the gates. Then one night I sneaked into the forest and got her. It wasn't so lonely after that. Now I had something to talk to. She was small when I got her. It would be too dangerous to go near a full-grown one, but she grew rapidly. That was because I caught small animals and brought them to her. Not having to depend on what she could catch, she grew almost twice as fast as usual, and was so sleek and pretty. Really, she was a pet to be proud of. I don't know how I could have stood the 4 months there alone, if I hadn't her to talk to. I don't think she really understood me, but I pretended she did, and that helped. Every 3 or 4 weeks, 3 of the council members came to take a part of the treasure, or to add to it. Always 3 of them. That's why I was so surprised one day to see one man coming by himself. It was Grem, the little old member, who had recommended that I be given this job. I was happy to see him, and we talked for a while, mostly about my work and how I liked it. I almost told him about my pet, but I didn't, because he might be angry at me for breaking the law. Finally, he asked me to give him the key. "I've been sent to get something from the treasure," he explained. I was unhappy to displease him, but I said, "I can't let you have it. There must be 3 members. You know that." "Of course, I know it, but something came up suddenly, so they sent me alone. Now, let me have it." I shook my head. That was the one order they had given me, never to give the key to any one person who came along. Grem became quite angry. "You idiot!" he shouted. "Why do you think I had you put out here? It was so I could get in here and help myself to the treasure." "But that would be dishonest, and there are no dishonest people in the state." "For 3,000 years I know." His usually kind face had an ugly look I had never seen before. "But I'm going to get part of that treasure, and it won't do you any good to report it, because no one is going to take the word of a fool like you against a respected council member. They'll think you are the dishonest one. Now, give me that key." It's a terrible thing to disobey a council member. But if I obeyed him, I would be disobeying all the others, and that would be worse. "No!" I shouted. He threw himself upon me. For his size and age he was very strong, stronger even than I. I fought as hard as I could, but I knew I wouldn't be able to keep him away from the key for very long, and if he took the treasure, I would be blamed. The council would have to think a new punishment for dishonesty. Whatever it was, it would be terrible indeed. He drew back and rushed at me. Just as he hit me, my foot caught upon a root, and I fell. His rush carried him past me, and he crashed through the brush screen beside the path. I heard him scream twice. Then there was silence. I was bruised all over, but I managed to pull myself up and take away what was left of the screen. There was no sign of Grem, but my beautiful pet was waving her pearl-green feelers as she always did in thanks for a good meal. That's why I can't tell anyone what happened. No one would believe that Grem would be dishonest, and I can't prove it, because she ate the proof. Even if I did tell them, no one is going to believe that a flycatcher plant, even a big one like mine, would actually be able to eat a man. So they think that Grem disappeared, and I'm still out here with her. She's grown so much larger now, and more beautiful than ever. But I hope she hasn't developed a taste for human flesh. Lately, when she stretches out her feelers, it seems that she's trying to reach me. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Margenes by Miriam Allen DeFord. Originally published in If Worlds of Science Fiction, February 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. There is a small striped smelt called the grunion, which has odd egg-laying habits. At high tide, on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th nights after the full of the moon from March to June, thousands of female grunions ride in on the waves to a beach in Southern California near San Diego, dig tail first into the soft sand, deposit their eggs, then ride back on the wash of the next wave. The whole operation lasts about 6 seconds. On the nights when the grunion are running, hordes of people used to come to the beach with baskets and other containers, and with torches to light the scene and try to catch the elusive little fish in their hands. They were doing that on an April night in 1960. In the midst of the excitement of the chase, only a few of them noticed that something else was riding the waves in with the grunions. Among the few who stopped grunion catching long enough to investigate were a girl named Marge Hicken and a boy named Gene Towanda. They were UCLA students going together who had come down on Saturday from Los Angeles for the fun. "What on earth do you think these can be, Gene?" Marge asked, holding out on her palms 3 or 4 of the little circular, wriggling objects, looking like small-sized doughnuts, pale straw in color. "Never saw anything like them," Gene admitted. "But then, my major's psychology, not zoology. They don't seem to bite anyway. Here, let's collect some of them instead of the fish. That dingus of yours will hold water. We can take them to the marine biology lab tomorrow and find out what they are." Marge Hicken and Gene Towanda had started a worldwide economic revolution. None of the scientists at the university laboratory knew what the little live straw-colored circles were either. In fact, after a preliminary study, they wouldn't say positively whether the creatures were animal or vegetable. They displayed voluntary movement, but they seemed to have no respiratory or digestive organs. They were completely anomalous. The grunion ran again that night, and Gene and Marge stayed down to help the laboratory assistants gather several hundred of the strange new objects for further study. They were so numerous that they were swamping the fish, and the crowds at the beach began to grumble that their sport was being spoiled. Next night, the grunions stopped running, but the little doughnuts didn't. They never stopped. They came in by hundreds of thousands every night, and those which nobody gathered wriggled their way over the land until some of them even turned up on the highways, where a lot of them were smashed by automobiles, on the streets and sidewalks of La Jolla, and as far north as Oceanside and as far south as downtown San Diego itself. The things were becoming a pest. There were indignant letters to the papers, and editorials were written calling on the authorities to do something. Just what to do, nobody knew. The only way to kill the circular little objects from the sea seemed to be to crush them, and they were too abundant for that to be very effective. Meanwhile, the laboratory kept studying them. Marge and Gene were interested enough to come down again the next weekend to find out what, if anything, had been discovered. Not much had, but one of the biochemists at the laboratory casually mentioned that chemically the straw-colored circles seemed to be almost pure protein, with some carbohydrates and fats, and that apparently they contained all the essential vitamins. College student that he was, Gene Towanda immediately swallowed one of the wriggling things down whole as a joke. It tickled a little, but that wasn't what caused the delighted amazement on his face. "Gosh!" he exclaimed. "It's delicious!" He swallowed another handful. That was the beginning of the great Margene industry. It was an astute reporter, getting a feature story on the sensational new food find, who gave the creatures their name, in honor of the boy and girl who had first brought the things to the attention of the scientists. He dubbed them Margenes, and Margenes they remained. Dr. O. Y. Willard, director of the laboratory, his story said in part, thinks the Margenes may be the answer to the increasing and alarming problem of malnutrition, especially in undeveloped countries. For decades now, he said, scientists have been worried by the growing gap between world population and world food facilities, over-farming, climatic changes caused by erosion and deforestation, the encroachment of building areas on agricultural land, and above all, the unrestricted growth of population, greatest in the very places where food is becoming scarcest and most expensive, have produced a situation where, if no remedy is found, starvation or semi-starvation may be the fate of half the earth's people. The ultimate result would be the slow degeneration and death of the entire human race.
Many remedies have been suggested, Dr. Willett commented further. They range from compulsory birth control to the production of synthetic food, hydroponics, and the harvesting of plankton from the oceans. Each of these presents almost insuperable difficulties. The one ideal solution would be the discovery of some universal food that would be nourishing, very cheap, plentiful, tasty, and that would not violate the taboos of any people anywhere in the world. In the Margenes, we may have discovered that food. We don't know where the Margenes come from, the director went on to say, and we don't even know yet what they are, biologically speaking. What we do know is that they provide more energy per gram than any other edible product known to man, that everyone who has eaten them is enthusiastic about their taste, that they can be processed and distributed easily and cheaply, and that they are acceptable even to those who have religious or other objections to certain other foods, such as beef among the Hindus or pork among the Jews and Muslims. Even vegetarians can eat them, Dr. Willett remarked, since they are decidedly not animal in nature. Neither, I may add, are they vegetable. They are a hitherto utterly unknown synthesis of chemical elements in living form. Their origin remains undiscovered. Naturally, there was no thought of feeding people on raw Margenes. Only a few isolated places in either hemisphere would have found live food agreeable. Experiment showed that the most satisfactory way to prepare them was to boil them alive, like crabs or lobsters. They could then be ground and pressed into cakes, cut into convenient portions. 1 inch square cube made a nourishing and delicious meal for a sedentary adult, 2 for a man engaged in hard physical labor. And they kept coming in from the Pacific Ocean nightly, by the million. By this time, none of them had to be swept off streets or highways. The beaches where for nearly a century throngs had gathered for the sport of catching grunion was off bounds now. It was the property of California Margene Incorporated, a private corporation heavily subsidized by the federal government as an infant industry. The grunions themselves had to find another place to lay their eggs, or die off. Nobody cared which. The sand they had used for countless millennia as an incubator was hemmed in by factory buildings and trampled by margine gatherers. The whole beautiful shore for miles around was devastated. The university had to move its marine biological laboratory elsewhere. La Jolla, once a delightful suburb and tourist attraction, had become a dirty, noisy, honky-tonk town where processing and cannery workers lived and spent their off hours. The unique Torrey pines had been chopped down because they interfered with the erection of a freight airport. But half the world's people were living on Margenes. The sole possession of this wonderful foodstuff gave more power to the United States than had priority in the atomic bomb. Only behind the Iron Curtain did the product of California Margene Incorporated fail to penetrate. Pravda ran parallel articles on the same day, one claiming that Margenes, Brzeznyoya, had first appeared long ago on a beach on the Caspian Sea and had for years formed most of the Russian diet. The other warning the deluded nations receiving free supplies as part of American foreign aid that the Margenes had been injected with drugs aimed at making them weak and submissive to the exploitation of the capitalist imperialists. There was a dangerous moment at the beginning when the sudden sharp decline in stocks of all other food products threatened another 1929. But with federal aid, a financial crash was averted, and now a new high level of prosperity had been established. Technological unemployment was brief, and most of the displaced workers were soon retained for jobs in one of the many ramifications of the new Margene industry. Agriculture, of course, underwent a short, deep depression, not only in America, but all over the world, but it came to an end as food other than Margenes quickly became a luxury product. Farmers were able to cut their production to a small fraction of the former yield and to get rich on the dizzying prices offered for bread, apples, or potatoes. and this increased the prosperity of the baking and other related industries as well. In fact, ordinary food costs, which meant margin costs, were so low that a number of the larger unions voluntarily asked for wage decreases in their next contracts. California Margene Incorporated was able to process, pack, and distribute margin cakes at an infinitesimal retail price by reason of the magnitude of the output. An era of political good feeling fell upon the Western world, reflected from the well-fed comfort of vast populations whose members never before in their lives had had quite enough to eat. The fear of famine seemed to be over forever, and with it the fear of the diseases and the social unrest that follow famine. Even the USSR and its satellites, in a conciliatory move in the United Nations Assembly, suggested that the long Cold War ought to be amenable to a reasonable solution through a series of amicable discussions. The Western nations, assenting, guessed shrewdly that the Iron Curtain countries wanted in on the margines. Marge Hicken and Jean Towanda, who had started it all, left college for copywriting jobs with the agency handling the enormous margin publicity. They were married a few months later. And the margines continued to come in from the sea in countless millions. They were being harvested now from the Pacific itself, near the shoreline, before they reached the beach. Still no research could discover their original source. Only a few scientists worried about what would happen if the margins should disappear as suddenly as they had arrived. Attempts at breeding the creatures had failed completely. They did not undergo fission. They did not sporulate. They seemed to have no sex. No methods of reproduction known in the plant or animal kingdom seemed to apply to them. Hundreds of them were kept alive for long periods. They lived with equal ease in either air or water, and they did not take nourishment, unless they absorbed it from their environment, but no sign of fertility ever appeared. Neither did they seem to die of natural causes. They just kept coming in. On the night of May 7th, 1969, not a single margin was visible in the ocean or on the beach. They never came again. What happened as a result is known to every student of history. The worldwide economic collapse, followed by the fall of the most stable governments, the huge riots that arose from the frantic attempts to get possession of the existing stocks of margin cakes or of the rare luxury items of other edibles, the announcement by the USSR that it had known from the beginning the whole thing was a gigantic American hoax in the interest of the imperialistic bloodsuckers, the simultaneous atomic attacks by East and West, the short war of 1970 that ruined most of what bombs had spared of the earth, the slow struggle back of the remnant of civilization which is all of existence you and I have ever known. All these were a direct outgrowth of that first appearance of the margins on the beach near San Diego on an April night in 1960. Marge and Jean Towanda were divorced soon after they had both lost their jobs. She was killed in the hydrogen blast that wiped out San Diego. He fell in the war of 1970. Margene became a dirty word in every language on earth. What small amount of money and ability can be spared is, as everyone knows, devoted today to a desperate international effort to reach and colonize another habitable planet of the solar system, if such there be. As for the margines themselves, out of the untold millions that had come, only a few thousand were lucky enough to survive and find their way back to their overcrowded starting point. In their strange way of communication, as incomprehensible to us as would be their means of nourishment and reproduction, or their constitution itself, they made known to their kin what had happened to them. There is no possibility, in spite of the terrific overpopulation of their original home and of the others to which they are constantly migrating, that they will ever come here again. There has been much speculation, particularly among writers of science fiction, on what would happen if aliens from other planets should invade Earth. Would they arrive as benefactors or as conquerors? Would we welcome them, or would we overcome and capture them and put them in zoos and museums? Would we meet them in friendship or with hostility? The Margenes gave us the answer. Beings from outer space came to Earth in 1960, and we ate them.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Doorway by Evelyn E. Smith. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, September 1955. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It is my theory, Professor Falabella said, helping himself to a cookie, that no one ever really makes a decision. What really happens is that whenever alternative courses of action are called for, the individuality splits up and continues on two or more divergent planes, very much like the parthenogenesis of an unicellular animal. Delicious cookies, these, Mrs. Hughes.
Thank you, Professor, Gloria simpered. I made them myself. You must give us the recipe, said one of the ladies, and the others murmured agreement, glad to get their individualities on a plane they could understand.
Since most decisions are hardly as momentous as the individual imagines, Professor Falabella continued, and since the imagination of the average individual is very limited, many of these different planes, or as they are colloquially known, space-time continuums, may exist in close, even tangential relationship. Gloria rose unobtrusively and took the teapot to the kitchen for a refill. Her husband stood by the sink, moodily drinking whiskey out of the bottle, so as to avoid having to wash a glass afterward.
Bill, you're not being polite to our guests. Why don't you go out and listen to Professor Falabella?
I can hear him perfectly well from here, Bill muttered, and indeed the Professor's mellifluous tones pervaded every nook and cranny of the thin-walled house. Long-winded cultist. What is he a professor of, I'd like to know?
Professor Falabella is not a cultist, affirmed Gloria angrily. He's a great philosopher.
Bill Hughes said something unprintable. If I'd married Lucy Allison, he continued unkindly, she'd never have filled the house with long-haired cultists on my so-called day of rest. Gloria's soft chin trembled, and her blue eyes filled with tears. She was beginning to put on weight, he noticed.
I've been hearing nothing but Lucy Allison, Lucy Allison, Lucy Allison for the past year. You said yourself she looked like a horse.
Horses, he observed, have sense. He was being brutal, but he couldn't help it and didn't want to. Professor Falabella was only the most long-winded of a long series of mystics Gloria was forever dragging into the house. The trouble with the half-educated, he thought bitterly, is that they seek culture in the most peculiar places. I'll bet she would have let me have peace on Sunday, he said. It just goes to show what happens when you marry a woman solely for her looks. He drained the bottle, then hurled it into the garbage pail with a resounding crash. Gloria's shoulders shook as she filled the kettle.
I wish I'd decided to be an old maid, she sobbed.
A very unlikely possibility, he thought. Even now, shop-worn as she was, Gloria could have fairly wide range of suitors should something happen to him. She looked sexy, but how deceiving appearances could be. Professor Falabella was still talking as Bill and Gloria emerged from the kitchen. I believe that it is possible for an individual who exists on a limited plane of imagination to transpose from one plane to an adjacent one without difficulty. Great heavens, what was that? Something had whisked past the archway leading to the foyer.
Don't pay any attention, Gloria smiled nervously. The house is haunted. My dear, one of the ladies offered, I know of the most marvellous exterminator. The house, Gloria assured her coldly, really is haunted. We've been seeing things ever since we moved in. And she really believed it, Bill thought. Believed that the house was haunted, that is. Of course he had seen things too, but he was enlightened enough to know that ghosts don't exist, even if you do see them. Professor Falabella cleared his throat. As I was saying, it is possible to send the individual through another, dimension, as some popular writers would have it, to one of his other spatial existences on the same temporal plane. It is merely necessary for him to find the door. Nonsense, Bill interrupted. Wholly unmitigated nonsense. Every head swiveled to look at him. Gloria restrained tears with an effort. Brute, someone muttered. But ridicule apparently only stimulated the professor. He beamed. You don't believe me. Your imagination cannot extend to the comprehension of the multifariousness of space. Nonsense, Bill said again, but less confidently. I believe that I have discovered the doorway, Professor Falabella continued, and the way is open. However, most people fear to penetrate the unknown, even though it is to enter another phase of their own existence. I do admit that the shock of spatial transference, no matter how slight, combined with the concrete awareness of a previous spatial relationship, would be perhaps too much for the keenly sensitive individualism. Bill opened his mouth. I know what you're about to say, young man. You don't have to be a mind reader to know that, Bill assured him. His consonants were already a little slurred, and he knew Gloria was ashamed of him. It served her right. He'd been ashamed of her for years. Professor Falabella smiled. His teeth were very sharp and white. Very well, Mr. Hughes. Since you are a skeptic, perhaps you will not object to being the subject of our experiment yourself. What kind of an experiment? Bill asked suspiciously. Merely to go through the door. Any door can become the doorway if it is transposed into the proper spatial dimension. That door, for instance. Professor Falabella waved his hand toward the doorway of what Gloria liked to call Bill's study. You mean you just want me to open the door and go into that room? Bill asked incredulously. That's all? That is all. Of course, you go with the awareness that it is the threshold of another plane, and that you will step voluntarily from this existence to an adjacent one. Sure, Bill said. He had just remembered there was a nearly full bottle of Calvert in the bottom drawer of the desk. Sure, anything to oblige. Very well, go to the door, and keep remembering that your own free will you are passing from this plane to the next. Look out, everybody, Bill called raucously as he pulled open the door. I'm coming in on the next plane. No one laughed. He stepped over the threshold, shutting the door firmly behind him. A wonderful excuse to get away from those blasted women. He'd climb out of the window as soon as he'd collected the whiskey, and give them a nervous moment, thinking he'd really passed into another existence. It would serve Gloria right. For a moment, as he crossed, he had a queer sensation. Maybe there was something in what Professor Falabella said. But no, there he was in the study. All that mumbo-jumbo was getting him down, that was all. He was a nervous man, only nobody appreciated the fact. Taking a cigarette out of the pack in his pocket, he reached for the lighter on his desk. It wasn't there. Time and time again he'd told Gloria not to touch his things, and always she'd disobeyed him. Company was coming, and she must tidy up. Cooking and cleaning, that was all she was good for. But this was carrying tidiness too far. She'd even removed the ashtrays. And where did that glass block paperweight come from? He'd had a penguin in a snowstorm, and he'd been happy with it. This was too much. He'd tell Gloria off, stealing a man's penguin. He opened the door into the living room and bumped into Lucy Allison. "Don't you think you've been in there long enough, Bill?" she asked acridly. "I'm sure your guests would appreciate catching a glimpse of you." "Why, hello, Lucy," he said, surprised. "I didn't know Gloria had invited you." "Gloria, Gloria, Gloria," Lucy cut across his sentence. "You've been talking about nothing but that dumb little blonde for months." Because of the people in the room beyond, her voice was pitched low, but her pale eyes glittered unpleasantly behind her spectacles. "I wish you had married her. You'd have made a fine pair." Gently, caressingly, the short hairs on the back of Bill's neck rose. "Come back in here," Lucy said, hauling him back into the living room where a number of people who had been enjoying the domestic fracas suddenly broke into loud and animated chatter. "Dr. Hildebrand was telling us all about nuclear fission." "Can't find an ashtray," Bill muttered, seizing on something tangible. "Can't find an ashtray in the whole darn place." "We've been over this millions of times, Bill. You know," she smiled at the guests, a smile that carefully excluded Bill. "I'm allergic to smoke, but I never can get my husband to remember he isn't to smoke inside the house." "Now take the neutron, for example," Dr. Hildebrand said through a mouthful of pâté. "What is the neutron? It is only— What was that?" The wraith of Gloria crossed the foyer and disappeared. Bill took a step forward, then stood still. Lucy smiled self-consciously. "That's nothing at all. The house is merely haunted." Everyone laughed. "Forgot something," Bill muttered, and dashed back into the study. He yanked open the bottom drawer of the desk. Sure enough, there was a bottle of Chenelet, nearly a third full. There are some advantages, he thought as he tilted it to his lips, in having a limited imagination.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
The Stroller by Margaret St. Clair. Originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, August 1947. Narrated by Tom Trussel. All sorts of things come in on a space freighter. Even in the old days, grocers were always finding 20-foot pythons curled cozily inside bunches of bananas from South America. And what sort of undesired stowaways do you suppose you get when you have a cargo of tongarus from South Venus, agitized Fiala corums from the distant around Aphrodisian, hand-painted lumigraphs on Gur fibre made in Marsport Prefecture, and golden rinks jewellery from the canal centres? George Saunders, supercargo of the SS Trito, gave his wife a warm kiss on the cheek. "For Pete's sake," he hissed into her ear, "act like you're glad to see me, can't you? The old man's watching us." Martha Saunders hesitated a moment, and then threw her plump body into her husband's arms. "Oh, Georgie," she squealed, "you sweet old thing, it's so wonderful to see you again." "That's enough," George rumbled warningly. He was swaying a little from the impact. "Don't want to overdo it. Let's get out of here." They started over to the parking area of the spaceport where their copter was. "What's the matter?" Martha demanded as soon as they were out of earshot of the ship. "What do you care what the captain thinks about us?" "Listen, Martha. The old fool's been riding me ever since we left Aphrodisian. Says I'm the most incompetent supercargo he's ever had. Just before we docked today, he said he thought he'd take it up with the Union. If he does, you know what'll happen. Pink said the last time that if he got one more complaint about me, he'd take the case to the executive board. I'd lose my license, sure." "Oh." Martha seemed unwillingly impressed. She got an atomizer out of her hand case and began spraying quick-drying Cosmilac over the skin on her face and neck. "But what happened?" she asked an instant later when the cosmetic had set. Why is he so down on you?" For a moment the fine-etched lines of irritation and petulance faded from George Saunders's face, to be replaced by an expression of honest perplexity. "Marta, Wait, here's the copter. I'll tell you about it after we get in. And for the love of heaven, don't drop any pop bottles out of the window the way you did the last time I was in port. Having the air police after us would be the last straw as far as my nerves are concerned." He slid into the driver's seat. Marta got 2 bottles of pop out of the refrigerator, shoved straws into their necks, pulled a shelf out of the panelling to hold 1 bottle at a convenient level under George's nose, and began drinking out of the other herself. "Well?" she asked after a couple of swallows. George drank from his bottle before replying. "It's the darndest thing. I remember beginning to load number 2 in 3 holes at Aphrodisian, and I remember telling the longshore leaderman to have the hatch covers put on again when the holes were filled. But there's 6 or 8 hours in there during the loading I don't remember a single thing about. They're totally gone. Well, the way the ship handled at the takeoff from Aphrodisian, the old man thought there must be something wrong, and when we were out in space he went in for a look. Wow, I can see sort of why he's sore. Those holes look like somebody'd stirred the things in 'em up with a big stick. About a third of the cargo's ruined. The Tongarus have leaked all over those blasted lumigraphs, and, well, the insurance company is going to raise blue murder, and the owners won't like it one little bit." George licked his thin lips. "What I want to know," he burst out, "is what happened to me. I must have told the longshoremen to load the holes like that, but when we were 2 days out of Venus, I asked Sparks, he's had a pre-medical course and he's saving up the tuition for medical school, to look me over. He gave me all the tests, dozens of 'em, and finally told me there wasn't a thing wrong with me mentally or physically, except that I needed more rest. Rest, bourgeois. I've been sleeping 10 hours a night, and I wake up tireder than when I went to bed." Marta studied him. "You do look sort of tired," she observed. "Maybe you need some Vita-Ray treatments." George ignored this comment. "Of course, the old man's not such a bad guy," he said. "He never said anything about that time I missed the ship at Marsport." "You mean that time you were so drunk on Soma? One of the times?" George gave an irritated shrug. "Never mind that," he snapped. "I mentioned it because I asked him to have dinner with us on Thursday, the day before we sail, and I want you to have a real old-fashioned home-cooked meal for him. Maybe I can soften him up, have something nice for him. None of this complete meal stuff out of the freezer. Have something good, out of cans." "You mean like my canned crab and mushroom casserole?" "Mm-hmm. Have that. And what's that dessert you make with the canned peaches on the Soma? Pêche flambée or something. You might like that." George set the copter down neatly on the roof of the apartment house. "Remember," he said, "I've got to make a good impression on him. Flatter him as much as you can, but use your head about it. And if you get any kind of chance to tell him about how reliable I usually am, do it." The day moved on toward Thursday. George continued to complain of fatigue, and on Tuesday night Marta woke up shrieking with a vague and horrible nightmare, but it was attributed to indigestion. After a dose of antacid, she went back to sleep. On Wednesday, she had her hallucination. She was putting a bunch of old digests and tabloids away in the closet of the living room when she came across the jacket George had used 4 or 5 years ago when he went grotch hunting. "George," she called. "Oh, George, can I throw your old grey jacket away? It's full of moth holes."
"What are you yelling at me for?" George asked irritably from behind her. He had been sitting in his study, and was only about 5 feet distant from the closet, drinking Soma. "I'm right here." Marta came out of the closet and stared at him. One hand went to her heart. The pallor of her heavy, sagging face showed through a thick face lacquer as a muddy grey. "What? I saw you go into the kitchen," she said. "You were wearing your brown suit.
I was looking right at you, and you walked the length of the living room and went into the kitchen and closed the door behind you. That's why I yelled at you. You were wearing your brown suit. You got the blue one on now. You were wearing your brown suit." "Shut up," George said passionately. "Are you trying to drive me crazy? I've been sitting right here all the time. What do you mean you saw me walk into the kitchen? You couldn't have. I've been sitting here all the time." "But I saw you. You were wearing your brown suit." "You imagined it," her husband shrieked at her. "It's your imagination. You shut up. What are you trying to do? Get me so nervous the old man will think I'm ready for the loony bin? You imagined it." Martha looked at him. She had to lick her lips twice before she could answer. Yes, of course. That must be it. I imagined it." George spent the rest of the day drinking soma and holding his hands up before his eyes to see if they had stopped shaking. Martha got a 5-suit deck of cards out of the closet and played solitaire. None of her games came out, but she was too distraught to realize that she had left 2 of the cards inside their box. Surprisingly, both George and Martha slept well. They awakened far more cheerful than they had been the night before. Even their pre-breakfast snapping at each other lacked its usual note of bitter sincerity. When Martha left the apartment and started out to do her shopping, she was humming under her breath. The canned crab was easy enough to locate, but she had to go to 3 stores before she could find the peaches and the mushrooms. She ran them to earth at last in a little grocery on a side street. Just as she was leaving it, her eye caught the flash of a red label on a rose shelf near the door, and she triumphantly dug out 2 cans of tomato soup. "See what I got," she said, showing her prize to George when she got back home. "I guess I'm lucky or something. It's awfully hard to find." "Gosh," George shut off the video to give her his full attention. "That's wonderful. I happen to know the old man's crazy about it. His mother used to have it all the time. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if it makes him change his mind completely about going to the Union. Martha, you're a smart girl." Martha spent the rest of the day at the beauty shop, getting her hair re-garnished with galloons and her face set. She wanted to make the best possible impression on the captain. Around 5:30, she began getting dinner. It doesn't take long to open cans. And an hour or so later, the old man, his name was Course, was chiming at the door. Course was definitely stiff at first. He greeted Saunders with resentful formality, and gave Martha the merest flash of a smile before his face grew hard again. When the fragrant steam from the tureen of tomato soup Martha was bringing in blew toward him, he relaxed somewhat, and the salad of canned string beans, onions, lettuce, and mayonnaise softened him still more. By the time he had finished 2 big helpings of Martha's crab casserole, it began to look like the job was saved. He offered George a cigar, and began telling him a long story about what the little Martian hostess at the Silver Wheaterette had said to him. Martha went out in the kitchen to fix the pêche flambée. She cut sponge cake into neat rounds, spread discs of hard frozen banana ice cream over them, and crowned the structure of each dessert plate with half of an enormous canned clingstone peach. From a bottle she poured soma carefully over each of the peaches, set a bit of paper to burning by pressing it against the element in the atomic range, and then used the paper to ignite the soma on the peaches. "George," she called in direction of the dining apps. "Oh, George! Honey, help me with the plates." She heard him come in. She turned at his step, ready to pick up the plates, 1 in each hand, and give them to him. He was wearing his brown suit. But he was wearing the green one today, wasn't he? Because it was the best suit he had, and he wanted to impress the captain. His green. George's face slipped down toward the 4th button on his coat. It wavered, solidified, flowed back into place, and then slopped down over his lapels once more. Suddenly it solidified into a sort of tentacle. It came faltering towards Martha, half-blind but purposive. Martha tried to scream. Her throat was too constricted by terror to let out more than a mere thread of sound, but it had carrying power. George and Corse, out in the dining apse, heard it. They came running in. Corse was quick-witted. He picked up one of the plates with the soma burning on it and hurled it straight at the thing that was wearing George's clothes. There was an explosion, so loud that the plexiglass in the windows bulged outward for a moment, and then a bright, instant column of flame. Then nothing. George's brown suit lay collapsed and empty on the floor. "It was wearing your suit, George," Marta said hysterically. She was leaning back against the wall, looking faint and sick. "George, it was wearing your suit. Oh, what was it? What was it anyway?" Corse was looking at the debris on the floor. A peculiar expression, half satisfaction, half private insight, hovered around the corners of his lips. "It was a mocker, I think," he answered. "A mocker? What?" You still find a few of them in the wilder parts of Venus. They're parasitic, entities that feed on the life force, as well as the flesh of human beings. No doubt this one came aboard the ship at Aphrodite, in that consignment of Fiella Corums. They're invisible most of the time, so of course we didn't suspect it. "But how did it get here?" George demanded. "Why did it pick on Marta as a victim?" "Well, you see, the usual way a mocker works is to select someone as a host, as a sort of base of operations, and then range out from him whenever it wants to eat. For some reason, whenever it leaves its host, it takes on its feature and body and dresses itself in its clothes. That's what happened here. One of the first signs that a mocker is taking hold is a spell of amnesia, and of course that's what happened to you, Saunders, when we were taking on cargo at Aphrodite, though I didn't realize it at the time. A mocker doesn't usually kill its host directly, but it does draw on its life force to keep itself going, and it usually complains of feeling worn out and tired." Corse halted. Marta looked down at her husband's brown suit and the ice cream slowly melting across it. "Please, George, pick up that stuff before it ruins your suit completely," she said automatically. And then to Corse, "But what happened when you threw the plate at it? What happened? Oh, I was so scared." "Yes, the mockers are terrifying," Corse agreed. He seemed to square his broad shoulders. "However, at bottom they are unintelligent. Look at the stupidity of this one in attacking you when your husband and I were in the next room. And they are really not especially dangerous, provided you know the defense against them. You see, their body structure, while based on the same elements as our own, involves large quantities of free hydrogen between the body cells. Hydrogen ignites in ordinary air with explosive force. The end product's water, and when I threw that burning stuff at the creature, the hydrogen in its tissues exploded. It blew up. There's probably a good deal more water vapor in the air in this room than there was before I got rid of the thing." Corse cleared his throat. "There's another life form," he said with a faintly professional air, "allied with the mocker, but with important differences which is far more dangerous. That's the Stroller." "The Stroller?" Marta asked. George had put his arms around her. They were not an affectionate couple, but the moment seemed to call for tender demonstration. "Why do they call it that?" "No one knows exactly. It seems to come from the creature's own name for itself, for its fondness of taking long, long walks." Corse turned the cigar in his mouth. He poked at the suit lying on the floor with the toe of his shoe. "What does it do?" Marta queried. "Why is it so terribly dangerous?" "The Stroller doesn't hunt a host like the mocker," Corse replied. "Early in life, it takes over the identity of some human being, and it remains indistinguishable from a human being to any usual tests. It's so dangerous because there's absolutely no defense against it, no free hydrogen in its tissues. It's indestructible." "My," Marta said, "goodness." "It feeds, like the mocker, on both the flesh and the life force of human beings. Fortunately, Corse smiled, it's very, very rare. There are probably only a few strollers in the entire solar system, and they reproduce only at wildly separated intervals. Once more Corse halted, and poked absently at the clothing on the floor with the toe of his boot. There's a peculiarity about their feeding habits, he said. They'll go for years without feeling any desire to eat their special food, and then something will happen which makes them greedy. And after that, they can't be stopped before they feed. Goodness, Martha said again. She hid a nervous yawn behind her hand. George, get me a chair, will you? I'd like to sit down. To Corse, she said, How did you find out all these things? You must have made quite a study for the subject. Why, I've read several books about Venus, and I listened to all the casts on the video about it, but I've never heard either of these creatures mentioned before. It seems to be a sort of hobby of yours. George pushed a kitchen chair out for her. He sat down with a sigh of relief. Not a hobby, Corse corrected gently. His face began to waver and flow, as the mockers had done. Then it snapped back into place. He licked his lips very delicately. You see, I'm a stroller myself, and somehow I'm feeling that I'd like to eat.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. Green Grew the Lasses by Ruth Laura Wainwright. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, July 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The September evening was hot and humid, and Helen Raymond, watching her husband pace nervously about the living room, grew tenser by the minute. Robert would walk up to an open window, sniff abstractedly, move to the next window, and repeat the performance. "For goodness sakes, Robert, what are you snuffling about?" she finally demanded in exasperation. She had been on edge ever since her cousin Dora had arrived that afternoon. Dora had lost another of a long succession of short-lived jobs, and, as usual, had descended on them without warning for an indefinite visit. Wasn't it enough to have to bear that and the heat too, without Robert's acting up? "Smog's getting worse all the time," Robert complained. Dora lifted her nose to sniff daintily. "It is an odd smog. Now in New York we don't—" Her voice trailed off and left the sentence hanging as she drew in another sample of the night air. Helen sniffed too. "We look like a bunch of rabbits," she thought irritably. But Dora was right. It was an odd smog, sort of sweet and bitter at the same time. Not sulphuric like most of the smog they were used to, or the spoiled onions frying in rancid fat smell of oil wells when the wind was off the land. This odour made her think of rank tropical weeds, a jungle miasma, though she had never been near a jungle. There was something familiar about it, though, and then she remembered that her hands had smelled like that the morning after she had weeded the tiny garden alongside their house. The flower bed had been cluttered with weeds of a kind she had never seen before, horrible-looking things. Could they be the cause of that awful smell? They had sprung up everywhere lately, and, while she had pulled them out of their own garden, they were growing all over, and she couldn't very well weed the whole town, could she? Wait, I want to get something," she said, and ran outdoors. She came back with a sample of the weed, one that she pulled from the garden of the vacant house next door. The plant was about a foot high, with a straight, stiff stem of a bright metallic green, with a single row of inch-wide rosettes of chartreuse leaves or petals down one side of the stem. There could be no doubt about its being the cause of the unpleasant odour, and Helen held it out at arm's length. "What the heck is that?" Robert asked. "Smell," she said. "Phew! So that's it. What is it anyway?"
Helen shook her head. "Never saw anything like it until recently. I pulled them out of the garden, but they're all over." Helen carried the offending plant to the back door. When she came back, Robert peered at her intently, shut his eyes, and shook his head quickly, and then stared at her again. "Think you'll know me next time you see me?" she asked, annoyed. "First good look I've had at you this evening. What kind of face powder is that you're using? Don't tell me that peculiar shade is the latest fashion." Puzzled, Helen put her hand to her face as if she should be able to feel the colour. "Mum's green," chortled 8-year-old Bobby. "You ought to see yourself." "Green?" Helen asked worriedly. "Green," Robert said. "You feel all right?" "Anemia," Dora declared positively. "You don't eat properly. Not enough vitamins. Now, while I'm here—" A quick look in the mirror, and Helen told herself that she wasn't really a green, just sort of greenish, if you looked at her in the right light. By morning, the odd colour ought to be all gone. There was no sense in worrying. Anybody could look sort of off-colour now and then. Maybe Dora was right. She was anemic. But she was stunned by the first sight of herself in the mirror the next morning. There was no mistaking it this time. She was as green as grass, and Dora, too, was beginning to show signs of becoming that unbecoming colour. Reluctantly, Dora conceded that it might not be the diet after all. She hadn't been there long enough for it to have that much effect. Robert and Bobby were still shockingly normal. Whatever can it be?" Helen asked shakily, holding out her green hands. The only answer was a hysterical screaming that sent them all racing to the front door. The Raymonds lived in a typical California court, with 4 small houses facing 4 other small houses across a central walk that ran at right angles to the street. On this walk, most of the tenants were now gathered, and the Raymonds and Dora joined them. Helen didn't know whether to feel relieved or more dismayed when she saw that all the women and girls were as green as she, and just as terrified. Someone, of course, had called the police, and a prowl car hummed to a stop at the curb. A harassed, white-faced policeman leaned out of the window. "We're doing all we can," he called. "It's like this all over town. Don't know yet what caused it, but we're investigating." The car sped away. It was soon apparent that only Mimosa Beach was affected. Why, no one could guess. Some said it was all a publicity stunt of some kind, advertising a movie or television show, or a chlorophyll product, perhaps, but they couldn't explain how it worked, or why only women and girls were affected. And how could it possibly help sell anything? Overnight, Mimosa Beach became famous and infested with reporters and colour photographers, all male. There would have been a mass exodus if there had been any place to go, but other communities, fearing that their womenfolk would catch the greenness, like measles, refused to let them in. Besides, in Mimosa Beach they had the dubious comfort of all being alike, while elsewhere they would have been freaks. There was so little they could do to make themselves look attractive. The cosmetics they had, or that were available, were all wrong, but they did the best they could, though there was no hiding that ghastly green complexion. "What a shame your hair isn't red," Dora said one day to Helen. "Amy Olsen now, her hair really goes with green skin." Cocking her head to one side, she studied the younger woman intently. "Your hair, that mousy brown, wonder if we couldn't touch it up just a wee bit." Helen clenched her teeth against the coy, criticizing voice. "I'm not the flamboyant type," she said. Dora was as green as Helen by this time, and it certainly wasn't a bit more becoming to her. She seemed to be enjoying the publicity, though. Besides, it gave her a good excuse for not leaving. If only the greenness had come before Dora, they might have been spared one calamity. 4 girls moved into the house next to the Raymonds, the last house in the row. Neither the Raymonds nor Dora noticed that they had moved in. They came so quietly. The houses in the court were furnished, and they must have paid the rent, obtained the keys,
and walked in, all settled as soon as they closed the door behind them. It wasn't until they rang the Raymonds' doorbell in the early evening that anyone in the household was aware of them. "We moved next door," one of them said brightly to Helen when she answered the door. "We come see you, get acquainted. We come in?" "Of course," Helen said, and they trooped in. "We're the Raymonds, and this is my cousin, Dora Hastings." The new neighbour who had spoken first pointed to her companions, one by one. "Patricia Pontiac," she said, "Clara Ford, Mary Maroon, me," poking a thumb at her own midriff, "Jack Jones." "Jack Jones?" Helen repeated. "That's a man's name." "Man?" the girl asked blankly. "Man," Robert said impatiently, "like me." The four girls noticed him for the first time, and then they saw Bobby. They stared at the two of them, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with horror. They drew closer to each other, as if for protection, and shivered. Robert and Bobby looked at each other in bewildered embarrassment. "My husband and son," Helen said tartly. Did these odd creatures think all males were wolves, including 8-year-old Bobby? That colour," Mary Maroon quavered. "Not green." "Only dames are green," Bobby scornfully said. "Imagine," Dora tittered nervously. "Afraid of Robert and Bobby?" "Won't you sit down?" Helen asked. This nonsense of being scared of her menfolk had gone on long enough. She didn't want them to sit down. She wanted them to go. But she could hardly ask them to do that. Naturally, they sat down. Bobby turned on the television for a space opera, and the four new neighbours watched it avidly. When the spaceship landed on what was supposed to be Venus, they giggled behind their hands and looked at each other sidewise. Hadn't they ever seen a show like that before? What was so unusually funny about this one? When the commercial came on, Robert turned off the sound. Mary Maroon looked at Bobby, and then at Helen, who was sitting with her arm around her son. "You baby?" she asked. Helen smiled proudly. "Yes, this is my baby." Bobby squirmed indignantly. Mary Maroon then turned to Robert. "You got baby?" Robert said, "Sure, this is my baby," patting Bobby on the knee. To Helen he muttered, "What does she think, anyway?" The four stared at Robert and Bobby and Helen in such obvious confusion that Robert jumped up nervously to turn the sound back on. After the girls had gone home, Bobby was sent off to bed, and Robert, loosening his tie, demanded, "What's the matter with them anyhow? Do they have to stare at me as if I were a damned biological error? Don't they know what a man is, for heaven's sake?" "Really, Robert," Dora protested, blushing a deeper green. "Well, for gosh sakes." "Those names," Helen said. "Clara Ford, that's not too bad, but I'm not so sure about Mary Maroon." Dora nodded. "Mary White, Mary Black, so why not Mary Maroon? But Patricia Pontiac." Helen threw up her hands. "They must have made that one up. But Jack Jones." "Crazy, if you ask me," Robert said, pretending they were scared of me and Bobby. "There's a Patricia beauty shop next to the Pontiac agency," Dora suggested. "Maybe—" Funny way to get a name. Where the heck are they from? Robert wondered. "Must be from right here in town," Helen reminded him. "Otherwise they wouldn't be green." "You know, the greenness looks sort of natural on them," Dora said thoughtfully. "Well, think I'll go to bed." After she had gone, Helen said wistfully in a whisper, "If only awful things could sort of counteract each other in the way some poisons do." She started making up the Davenport bed. Dora had their room. "First Dora's coming, and our turning green, and now those crazy girls right next door. But 3 poisons. No, it wouldn't come out even." It was a day or two later when Helen found her new neighbours working in the little flower bed alongside their house. They were busily transplanting weeds of the kind responsible for the unpleasant odour. "For goodness sake!" Helen exclaimed, disgusted. "What in the world do you want with that stuff?
Why, it took the rest of us here in the court days to get it all out, and now you want to bring it back. Throw it away." "Oh, no," Patricia Pontiac objected, holding a bunch of the weeds against her heart protectingly. "It's fane weed." "You mean you've seen the stuff before?" Patricia nodded. "We have it all over where we come from. Must have fane weed." "But you couldn't have come from someplace else," Helen pointed out. "You wouldn't be green if you did." "All green where we come from," Mary Maroon said. "I don't know where that stuff, fane weed you call it, came from," Helen said, refusing to pay any attention to their claim that they came from someplace else where everyone was green. There just wasn't any such place. "We drop seed other time we come," Patricia said. Then she added indignantly, "You no believe we come from other place?" "What other place?" asked Helen with weary politeness. "You call it Venus." "That picture the other night," Clara Ford giggled. "Not like Venus at all. So funny." Helen could stand no more. "So are you," she said rudely, and went into the house. They were even crazier than she'd thought. Greener, too, when you saw them in broad daylight. Did the greenness affect the mind? And the greener you got, the zanier you became? Would she get to be like that? The idea frightened her. "No turn green?" Patricia Pontiac asked Robert plaintively one day, as if she were blaming him for her bewilderment. "No," he answered shortly, "but I don't blame you for envying us men. It must be tough to be that lousy-looking colour." "Green is good colour," Mary Maroon declared stoutly. "You no have baby yourself." "Of course not." Patricia turned to Helen. "Then what's she for?" "He," Robert corrected, then added sarcastically, "Papa works to buy baby shoes. Now does that answer your question?" Helen sighed. There was just no use trying to explain anything to those 4 girls. Fall and winter passed. The dull monotony of being green was accented now and then by articles and pictures in newspapers and magazines, and by rumours, always proved false, that a remedy had been found, though chemists, biologists, and doctors continued hunting for the cause of the catastrophe. Autopsies provided no clue. Women protested that the doctors were looking at them with a wishful drop-dead expression, as if the next autopsy might be the one that would supply the answer. The greenness was still confined to Mimosa Beach. Other communities kept up their quarantine. The 4 girls next door to the Raymonds were as zany as ever, and Dora Hastings stayed on, of necessity. And then the monotony was broken by greater calamities. First, there was the matter of Patricia Pontiac's approaching motherhood. While this, of course, made no difference as far as the town was concerned, Dora was greatly perturbed, and, ever being one to insist on others keeping within the limits of her own narrow paths, she took the girl to task. "Patricia," she insisted sternly, "there simply must be a man to blame for your condition. You must marry him. Think of the baby. You want him to be fatherless?" "Fatherless? Him?" Patricia repeated, frowning in perplexity. "What are you talking about? My little baby girl, all mine. This man business I don't understand." "Nonsense. You're just trying to pretend innocence." "Oh, give it up, Dora," Helen urged wearily. "She doesn't know what you're talking about." Dora raised sceptical eyebrows. "In her condition?" After that, Dora went around with a great air of virtue condescending to help the wayward. It must be a burden, Helen felt, to have to feel superior because of other people's faults. Such a negative sort of superiority. During the next few weeks, Dora had plenty of chance to feel superior. Other unmarried girls and women besides Patricia became pregnant, and, like Patricia, they insisted no man was responsible. But they were not complacent about it the way Patricia was. To them it was an indignity they did not deserve. "What's this town coming to anyway?" Dora demanded. "Parthenogenetic births, maybe," Helen ventured. "No one would have believed that we turned green, but we did. Honestly, Dora, I'm getting so I'd believe almost anything in this nightmare existence of ours, even that you are about to have a baby." "That," Dora rejoined acidly, "is not at all likely. But are you trying to imply that our turning green could have something to do with these shameful births?" "I didn't say that, but you could be right." "Humph," Dora snorted. "A lot of nonsense." The 4 girls were in the Raymonds' living room one afternoon, a week later, talking with Helen, when Dora, who had been feeling ill and had gone to the doctor's, walked in. She glared at the 4 girls. "I'm going to have a baby," she accused them. Helen drew her breath in sharply. "Oh, no, not you too." "Of course," Clara Ford said complacently. "Everyone have babies, except Robert and Bobby and the ones like them. Jack and Mary and I have ours before we leave Venus. Have only one each, of course." "But why am I like this? How can I have a baby this way?" Dora's voice was shrill with anger and panic. "How else?" Jack asked calmly. A little chill of horror raced down Helen's spine. Could these odd girls really be telling the truth? Were they from Venus, as they insisted? She could just imagine them coming to Earth, on a flying saucer maybe, listening to the radio to learn the language, spying on us, but not learning as much as they thought they did. She choked off a giggle, an incipient hysteria, as another thought struck her. "Will I have one of those? "You already have baby," Patricia said. "Can't see how you have baby before we come with faneweed to make you green." Helen and Dora stared at her. "You mean," Helen finally was able to ask, that weed caused all this? That little weed?" "But that is what we tell you all along, only you always walk away angry." All those scientists working so hard, Helen realized bitterly, and all the time what they were looking for was literally under their feet. How could anyone have thought that the faneweed was responsible for anything but the bad smell they had finally become accustomed to? "Why didn't I listen to these girls, pay more attention to what they said?" Helen asked herself. She might have been able to prevent a lot of things that had happened. She got up from her chair and walked nervously about. Well, she couldn't change the past, but she could stop further evil from the faneweed. "I'll bet they don't have men on Venus," she said to Dora, "judging from the way they act. Then they'd have to have parthenogenetic births." She turned to Patricia. "Why did you come to Earth? And why just to Mimosa Beach?" "We try little place, what you call sample, before we change whole world," Patricia explained, and then she added sadly, "So many of our babies die. Not enough people left on Venus. We think maybe you like to come to Venus with us, so we make you as us." "That was very, very wicked of you," Dora said severely. The 4 Venusians shrugged resignedly. "Might as well go home," Mary Maroon said. "They don't like it our way." "And leave me like this?" Dora demanded shrilly. "Get rid of faneweed, be as before," Patricia assured her. "With a baby I'll have trouble accounting for," Dora said bitterly. "Oh, no, you don't. You stay right here. And Helen, don't you tell anybody that it's the faneweed. Then people from other places won't know about my baby, and it won't matter here as long as things are the way they are." "You come with us," Clara suggested wheedlingly. "You'll like Venus. Venus so pretty. No work, all happiness." "No work? No wonder the babies die," Dora exclaimed. Helen could see the yeast of reform beginning to work in Dora. The 4 Venusians looked puzzled. "They do that all the time," Helen thought irritably. Aloud she said, "Dora, of course I'll have to tell about the faneweed. There are others involved, you know." "I don't suppose," Dora interrupted, "that you girls know anything about diet. Those babies could probably be saved with little intelligence and some hard work." When the 4 Venusians left shortly thereafter for their home, they took along Dora Hastings, who had great plans for their planet. With the faneweed on Earth destroyed,
the women and girls of Mimosa Beach returned to their original colour. Even the parthenogenetic baby girls born as a result of the unfortunate experiment of the Venusians were white. "Well, the bad things went in pairs after all," Helen said to Robert when everything was normal again. "The faneweed was the fourth evil, though we didn't know it, and when we got rid of the faneweed, the greenness left. The Venusians went away, and I do hope Dora's all right."
"She finally got what should be a lifetime job," Robert answered. He crossed his fingers and, looking out of a western window at Venus, bright against the darkening sky, added, "At least, Venus is farther away than New York. That ought to help."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Wind People by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Originally published in Worlds of If Science Fiction, February 1959. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It had been a long layover for the Starhome's crew, hunting heavy elements for fuel. 8 months on an idyllic green paradise of a planet, a soft, windy, whispering world inhabited only by trees and winds. But in the end, it presented its own unique problem. Specifically, it presented Captain Merrihew with the problem of Robin, male, father unknown, who had been born the day before, and a month prematurely, to Dr. Helen Murray. Merrihew found her lying abed in the laboratory shelter, pale and calm, with a child beside her. The little shelter, constructed roughly of green planks, looked out on the clearing which the Starhome had used as a base of operations during the layover, a beautiful place at the bottom of a wide valley, in the curve of a broad, deep-flowing river. The crew, tired of being ship-bound, had built 6 such huts and shacks in these 8 months. Merrihew glared down at Helen. He snorted. "This is a fine situation. You, of all the people in the whole damn crew, the ship's doctor. It's... Inarticulate with rage, he fell back on a ridiculously inadequate phrase. "It's criminal carelessness." "I know," Helen Murray, too young and far too lovely for a ship's officer on a 10-year cruise, still looked weak and white, and her voice was a gentle shadow of its crisp self. "I'm afraid 4 years in space made me careless." Merrihew brooded, looking down at her. Something about ship gravity conditions, while not affecting potency, made conception impossible. No child had ever been conceived in space, and none ever would. On planet layovers, the effect wore off very slowly. Only after 3 months aground had Dr. Murray started routine administration of antiseptin to the 22 women of the crew, herself included. At that time, she had been still unaware that she herself was already carrying a child. Outside, the leafy forest whispered and rustled, and Merrihew knew Helen had forgotten his existence again. The day-old child was tucked up in one of her rolled coveralls at her side. To Merrihew, he looked like a skinned monkey, but Helen's eyes smouldered as her hands moved gently over the tiny round head. He stood and listened to the winds, and said at random, "These shacks will fall to pieces in another month. It doesn't matter. We'll have taken off by then." Dr. Shaolin came into the shack, an angular woman of 35. She said, "Company, Helen? Well, it's about time. Here, let me take Robin." Helen said in weak protest, "You're spoiling me, Lynn." "It will do you good," Shaolin returned. Merrihew, in a sudden surge of fury and frustration, exploded. "Damn it, Lynn, you're making it all worse. He'll die when we go into overdrive, you know as well as I do."
Helen sat up, clutching Robin protectively. "Are you proposing to drown him like a kitten?" "Helen, I'm not proposing anything. I'm stating a fact." "But it's not a fact. He won't die in overdrive because he won't be aboard when we go into overdrive." Merrihew looked at Lynn helplessly, but his face softened. "Shall we put him to sleep and bury him here?" The woman's face turned white. "No!" she cried in passionate protest, and Lynn bent to disengage her frantic grip. "Helen, you'll hurt him. Put him down. There." Merrihew looked down at her, troubled, and said, "We can't just abandon him to die slowly, Helen." "Who says I'm going to abandon him?" Merrihew asked slowly. "Are you planning to desert?" he added after a minute. "There's a chance he'll survive. After all, his very birth was against all medical precedent. Maybe—" "Captain," Helen sounded desperate, "even drugged, no child under 10 has ever endured the shift into hyperspace drive. A newborn would die in seconds." She clasped Robin to her again and said, "It's the only way. You have Lynn for a doctor. Reynolds can handle my collateral duties. This planet is uninhabited. The climate is mild. We couldn't possibly starve." Her face, so gentle, was suddenly like rock. "Enter my death in the log if you want to." Merrihew looked from Helen to Lynn and said, "Helen, you're insane." She said, "Even if I'm sane now, I wouldn't be long if I had to abandon Robin." The wild note had died out of her voice, and she spoke rationally but inflexibly. "Captain Merrihew, to get me aboard the Starhome, you will have to have me drugged or taken by force. I promise you I won't go any other way. And if you do that, and if Robin is left behind or dies in overdrive, just so you will have my services as a doctor, then I solemnly swear that I will kill myself at the first opportunity." "My God," said Merrihew, "you are insane." Helen gave a very tiny shrug. "Do you want a mad woman aboard?" Shaolin said quietly, "Captain, I don't see any other way. We'd have had to arrange it that way if Helen had actually died in childbirth. Of two unsatisfactory solutions, we must choose the least harmful." And Merrihew knew that he had no real choice. "I still think you're both crazy," he blustered, but it was surrender, and Helen knew it. 10 days after the Starhome took off, young Colin Reynolds, technician, committed suicide by the messy procedure of slicing his jugular artery, which, in zero gravity, distributed several quarts of blood in big round globules all over his cabin. He left an incoherent note. Merrihew put the note in the disposal, and Shaolin put the blood in the ship's blood bank for surgery, and they hushed it up as an accident. But Merrihew had the unpleasant feeling that the layover on the green and windy planet was going to become a legend, spread in whispers by the crew. And it did, but that is another story. Robin was 2 years old when he first heard the voices in the wind. He pulled at his mother's arm and crooned softly in imitation. "What is it, lovey?" "Pretty," he crooned again to the distant murmuring sound. Helen smiled vaguely and patted the round cheek. Robin, his infant imagination suddenly distracted, said, "Hungry, Robin, hungry. Berries." "Berries after you eat," Helen promised absently, and picked him up. Robin tugged at her arm. "Mummy pretty too." She laughed, a rosy and smiling young Diana. She was happy on the solitary planet. They lived quite comfortably in one of the larger shacks, and only a little frown line between her eyes bore witness to the terror which had closed down on her in the first months, when every new day had been some new struggle, against weakness, against unfamiliar sounds, against loneliness and dread. Nights when she lay wakeful, sweating with terror, while the winds rose and fell again, and her imagination gave them voices. Bleak days when she wandered dazedly around the shack or stared moodily at Robin. There had been moments, only fleeting, and penanced with hours of shame and regret, when she thought that even the horror of losing Robin in those first days would have been less than the horror of spending the rest of her life alone here, when she had wondered why Merryhugh had not realized that she was unbalanced and forced her to go with him. By now, Robin would have been only a moment's painful memory. Still not strong, knowing she had to be strong for Robin, or he would die as surely as if she had abandoned him, she had spent the first months in a somnambulistic dream. Sometimes he had walked for days at a time in that dream. She would wake to find food that she could not remember gathering. Somehow, pervasive, the dream voices had taken over. The whispering winds had been full of voices and even hands. She had fallen ill and lain for days sick and delirious, and had heard a voice which hardly seemed to be her own, saying that if she died, the wind voices would care for Robin. And then the shock and irrationality of that had startled her out of delirium, agonized and trembling, and she had pulled herself upright and cried out, "No!" And the shimmer of eyes and voices had faded again into vague echoes, until there was only the stir of sunlight on the leaves, and Robin, chubby and naked, kicking in the sunlight, cooing with his hands outstretched to the rustle of leaves and shadows. She had known then that she had to get well. She had never heard the wind voices again, and her crisp scientific mind rejected the fanciful theory that if she only believed in the wind voices, she would see their forms and hear their words clearly. And she rejected them so thoroughly that when she heard them speak, she shut them away from her mind, and after a time heard them no longer, except in restless dreams. By now she had accepted the isolation and the beauty of their world, and begun to make a happy life for Robin. For lack of other occupation last summer, though the winter was mild and there was no lack of fruits and roots even then, Helen had patiently snared male and female of small animals like rabbits, and now she had a pen of them. They provided a change of diet, and after a few smelly, unsuccessful experiments, she had devised a way to supple their fur pelts. She made no effort at gardening, though when Robin was older she might try that. For the moment, it was enough that they were healthy and safe and protected. Robin was listening again. Helen bent her ear, sharpened by the silence, but heard only the rustle of wind and leaves, saw only falling brightness along a silvered tree trunk. Wind, when there were no branches stirring? Ridiculous, she said sharply, then snatched up the baby boy and squeezed him before hoisting him astride her hip. "Mummy doesn't mean you, Robin. Let's look for berries." But soon she realized that his head was tipped back, and that he was listening again, to some sound she could not hear. On what she said was Robin's 5th birthday, Helen had made a special bed for him in another room of the building. He missed the warmth of Helen's body and the comforting sound of her breathing, for Robin, since birth, had been a wakeful child. Yet, on the first night alone, Robin felt curiously freed. He did something he had never dared do before for fear of waking Helen. He slipped from his bed and stood in the doorway, looking into the forest. The forest was closer to the doorway now. Robin could fuzzily remember when the clearing had been wider. Now slowly, beyond the garden patch which Helen kept cleared, the underbrush and saplings were growing back, and even what Robin called the burned place was covered with new sparse grass. Robin was accustomed to being alone during the day, Even in his first year, Helen had had to leave him alone, securely fastened in the house, or inside a little tight fenced yard, but he was not used to being alone at night. Far off in the forest, he could hear the whispers of the other people. Helen said there were no other people, but Robin knew better, because he could hear their voices on the wind, like fragments of the songs Helen sang at bedtime, and sometimes he could almost see them in the shadowy spots. Once when Helen had been sick, a long time ago, and Robin had run helplessly from the fenced yard to the inside room and back again, hungry and dirty and furious because Helen only slept on the bed with her eyes closed, rousing up now and then to whimper like he did when he fell down and skinned his knee. The winds and voices had come into the very house. Robin had hazy memories of soothing voices, of hands that touched him more softly than Helen's hands, but he could not quite remember. Now that he could hear them so clearly, he would go and find the other people, and then, if Helen was sick again, there would be someone else to play with him and look after him. He thought gleefully, "Won't Helen be surprised?" and darted off across the clearing. Helen woke, roused not by a sound, but by a silence. She no longer heard Robin's soft breaths from the alcove, and after a moment she realized something else. The winds were silent. Perhaps, she thought, a storm was coming. Some change in air pressure could cause this stillness. But Robin... She tiptoed to the alcove. As she had suspected, his bed was empty. Where could he be? In the clearing? With a storm coming? She slid her feet into hand-made sandals and ran outside, her quivering call ringing out through the silent forest. "Robin! Oh, Robin!" Silence. And far away a little ominous whisper. And for the first time since that first frightening year of loneliness, she felt lost, deserted in an alien world. She ran across the clearing, looking around wildly, trying to decide which way he could have wandered. Into the forest? What if he had strayed toward the river bank? There was a place where the bank crumbled away, down toward the rapids. Her throat closed convulsively, and her call was almost a shriek. "Oh, Robin! Robin, darling, Robin!" She ran through the paths worn by their feet, hearing snatches of rustle, wind, and leaves suddenly vocal in the cold moonlight around her. It was the first time since the spaceship left them that Helen had ventured out into the night of their world. She called again, her voice cracking in panic. "Robin!" A sudden stray gleam revealed a glint of white, and a child stood in the middle of the path. Helen gasped with relief and ran to snatch up her son, then fell back in dismay. It was not Robin who stood there. The child was naked, about a head shorter than Robin, and female. There was something curious about the bare and gleaming flesh, as if she could see the child only in the full flush of the moonlight. A round, almost expressionless face was surrounded by a mass of colourless streaming hair, the exact colour of the moonlight. Helen's audible gasp startled her to a stop. She shut her eyes convulsively, and when she opened them, the path was black and empty, and Robin was running down the track toward her. Helen caught him up with a strangled cry and ran, clasping him to her breast, back down the path to their shack. Inside she barred the door and laid Robin down in her own bed and threw herself down, shivering, too shaken to speak, too shaken to scold him, curiously afraid to question. "I had a hallucination," she told herself. "A hallucination, another dream, a dream." A dream, like the other dream. She dignified it to herself as the dream, because it was not like any other dream she had ever had. She had dreamed it first before Robin's birth, and had been ashamed to speak of it to Shaolin, fearing the common-sense skepticism of the older woman. On their 10th night on the green planet, the star home was a dim recollection now, when Merryhugh's scientists had been convinced that the little world was safe, without wild beasts or diseases or savage natives. The crew had requested permission to camp in the valley clearing beside the river. Permission granted, they had gone apart in couples almost as usual, and even those who had no enduring liaison at the moment had found a partner for the night. It must have been that night. Colin Reynolds was 2 years younger than Helen, and their attachment, enduring over a few months of ship time, was based less on mutual passion than a sort of boyish need in him, a sort of impersonal feminine solicitude in Helen. All her affairs had been like that, companionable, comfortable, but never passionate. Curiously enough, Helen was a woman capable of passion, of great depths of devotion, but no man had ever roused it, and now no man ever would. Only Robin's birth had touched her deeply pent emotions. But that night, when Colin Reynolds was sleeping, Helen stayed restlessly awake, hearing the unquiet stirring of wind on the leaves. After a time, she wandered down to the water's edge, staying a cautious distance from the shore, for the cliff crumbled dangerously, and stretched herself out to listen to the wind voices. And after a time she fell asleep, and had the dream, which was to return to her again and again. Helen thought of herself as a scientist without room for fantasies, and that was why she called it, fiercely, a dream. A dream born of some undiagnosed conflict in her. Even to herself, Helen would not recall it in full. There had been a man, and to her it seemed that he was part of the green and windy world, and he had found her sleeping by the river. Even in her drowsy state, Helen had suspected that perhaps one of the other crew members, like herself, sleepless and drawn to the shining water, had happened upon her there. Such things were not impossible, manners and mores being what they were among starship crews. But to her, half dreaming, there had been some strangeness about him, which prevented her from seeing him too clearly even in the brilliant green moonlight. No dream and no man had ever seemed so living to her, and it was her fierce rationalization of the dream which kept her silent months later, when she discovered, to her horror and secret despair, that she was with child. She had felt that she would lose the haze and secret delight of the dream if she openly acknowledged that Colin had fathered her child. But at first, in the cool green morning that followed, she had not been at all sure it was a dream. Seeing only sunlight and leaves, she had held back from speaking, not wanting ridicule. Could she have asked each man of the star home, "Was it you who came to me last night?" Because if it was not, there are other men on this world, men who cannot be clearly seen even by moonlight. Severely she reminded herself, Merryhugh's men had pronounced the world uninhabited, and uninhabited it must be. 5 years later, hugging her sleeping son close, Helen remembered the dream, examined the content of a fantasy, and once again, shivering, repeated, "I had a hallucination. It was only a dream, because I was alone." When Robin was 14 years old, Helen told him the story of his birth and of the ship. He was a tall, silent boy, strong and hardy, but not talkative. He heard the story almost in silence, and looked at Helen for a long time in silence afterward. He finally said in a whisper, "You could have died. You gave up a lot for me, Helen, didn't you?" He knelt and took her face in his hands. She smiled and drew a little away from him. "Why are you looking at me like that, Robin?"
The boy could not put instant words to his thoughts. Emotions were not in his vocabulary. Helen had taught him everything she knew, but she had always concealed her feelings from her son. He asked at last, "Why did my father stay with you?" "I don't suppose it entered his head," Helen said. "He was needed on the ship. Losing me was bad enough." Robin said passionately, "I'd have stayed." The woman found herself laughing. "Well, you did stay, Robin." He asked, "Am I like my father?" Helen looked gravely at her son, trying to see the half-forgotten features of young Reynolds in the boy's face. No, Robin did not look like Colin Reynolds, nor like Helen herself. She picked up his hand in hers. Despite his robust health, Robin never tanned. His skin was pearly pale, so that in the green sunlight it blended into the forest almost invisible. His hand lay in Helen's palm like a shadow. She said at last, "No, nothing like him. But under this sun, that's to be expected." Robin said confidently, "I'm like the other people." "The ones on the ship, they—" "No," Robin interrupted. "You always said when I was older you'd tell me about the other people. I mean the other people here, the ones in the woods, the ones you can't see." Helen stared at the boy in blank disbelief. "What do you mean? There are no other people, just us." Then she recalled that every imaginative child invents playmates. "Alone," she thought. "Robin's always alone, no other children. No wonder he's a little strange." She said quietly, "You dreamed it, Robin." The boy only stared at her in bleak, blank alienation. "You mean," he said, "you can't hear them either?" He got up and walked out of the hut. Helen called, but he didn't turn back. She ran after him, catching at his arm, stopping him almost by force. She whispered, "Robin, Robin, tell me what you mean. There isn't anyone here. Once or twice I thought I had seen something by moonlight, only it was a dream. Please, Robin, please."
"If it's only a dream, why are you frightened?" Robin asked, through a curious constriction in his throat. "If they've never hurt you—" No, they had never hurt her. Even if her long-ago dream, one of them had come to her. "And the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair." A scrap of memory from a vanished life on another world sang in Helen's thoughts. She looked up at the pale, impatient face of her son and swallowed hard. Her voice was husky when she spoke. "Did I ever tell you about rationalization? When you want something to be true so much that you can make it sound right to yourself." "Couldn't that also happen to something you wanted not to be true?" Robin retorted with a mutinous curl of his mouth. Helen would not let go of his arm. She begged, "Robin, no. You'll only waste your life and break your heart looking for something that doesn't exist." The boy looked down into her shaken face, and suddenly a new emotion welled up in him, and he dropped to his knees beside her and buried his face against her breast. He whispered, "Helen, I'll never leave you. I'll never do anything you don't want me to do. I don't want anyone but you." And for the first time in many years, Helen broke into wild and uncontrollable crying, without knowing why she wept. Robin did not speak again of his quest in the forest. For many months he was quiet and subdued, staying near the clearing, hovering near Helen for days at a time, then disappearing into the forest at dusk. He heard the winds numbly, deaf to their promise and their call. Helen, too, was quiet and withdrawn, feeling Robin's alienation through his submissive mood. She found herself speaking to him sharply for being always underfoot, yet, on the rare days when he vanished into the forest and did not return until after sunset, she felt a restless unease that set her wandering the paths herself, not following him, but simply uneasy unless she knew he was within call. Once, in the shadows just before sunset, she thought she saw a man moving through the trees, and for an instant, as he turned toward her, she saw that he was naked. She had seen him only for a second or two, and after he had slipped between the shadows again, common sense told her it was Robin. She was vaguely shocked and annoyed. She firmly intended to speak to him, perhaps to scold him for running about naked and slipping away like that. Then, in a sort of remote embarrassment, she forbore to mention it. But after that, she kept out of the forest. Robin had been vaguely aware of her surveillance and knew when it ceased, but he did not give up his own pointless rambles, although even to himself he no longer spoke of searching, or of any dreamlike inhabitants of the woods. At times it still seemed that some shadow concealed a half-seen form, and the distant murmur grew into a voice that mocked him, a white arm, the shadow of a face, until he lifted his head and stared straight at it. One evening toward twilight he saw a sudden shimmer in the trees, and he stood fixedly as the stray glint resolved itself first into a white face with shadowy eyes, then into a translucent flicker of bare arms, and then into the form of a woman, arrested for an instant with a hand on the bole of a tree. In the shadowy spot, filled only with the last ray of a cloudy sunset, she was very clear, not cloudy or unreal, but so distinct that he could see even a small smudge or bramble scratch on her shoulder, and a fallen leaf tangled in her colourless hair. Robin, paralyzed, watched her pause, and turn, and smile, and then she melted into the shadows. He stood with his heart pounding for a second after she had gone, then whirled, bursting with the excitement of his discovery, and ran down the path toward home. Suddenly he stopped short, the world tilting and reeling, and fell on his face in a bed of dry leaves. He was still ignorant of the nature of the emotion in him. He felt only intolerable misery and the conviction that he must never, never speak to Helen of what he had seen or felt. He lay there, his burning face pressed into the leaves, unaware of the rising wind, the little flurry of blown leaves, the growing darkness and distant thunder. At last an icy spatter of rain aroused him, and cold, numbed, he made his way slowly homeward. Over his head the boughs creaked woodenly, and Robin, under the driving whips of the rain, felt the tumult only echoed his own voiceless agony. He was drenched by the time he pushed the door of the shack open, and stumbled blindly toward the fire, only hoping that Helen would be sleeping. But she started up from beside the hearth they had built together last summer. "Robin?" Deathly weary, the boy snapped, "Who else would it be?" Helen didn't answer. She came to him, a small, swift-moving figure in the firelight, and drew him into the warmth. She said, almost humbly, "I was afraid. The storm. Robin, you're all wet. Come to the fire and dry out." Robin yielded, his twitching nerves partly soothed by her voice. How tiny Helen is, he thought, and I can remember that she used to carry me around on one arm. Now she hardly comes to my shoulder. She brought him food, and he ate wolfishly, listening to the steady pouring rain, uncomfortable under Helen's watching eyes. Before his own eyes there was the clear memory of the woman in the wood, and so vivid was Robin's imagination, heightened by loneliness, and undiluted by any random impressions, that it seemed to him Helen must see her too. And when she came to stand beside him, the picture grew so keen in his thoughts that he actually pulled himself free of her. The next day dawned grey and still, beaten with long needles of rain. They stayed indoors by the smouldering fire, Robin half sick and feverish from his drenching, sprawled by the hearth too indolent to move, watching Helen's comings and goings about the room, not realizing why the sight of her slight, quick form against the grey light filled him with such pain and melancholy. The storm lasted 4 days. Helen exhausted her household tasks and sat restlessly thumbing through the few books she knew by heart. They had allowed her to remove all her personal possessions, all the things she had chosen on a forgotten and faraway earth for a 10-year star cruise. For the first time in years, Helen was thinking again of the life, the civilization she had thrown away, for Robin, who had been a pink scrap in the circle of her arm, and now lay sullen on the hearth, not speaking, aimlessly whittling a stick with a knife, found discarded in a heap of rubbish from the star-home, which was his dearest possession. Helen felt slow horror closing in on her. What world, what heritage did I give him in my madness? This world has driven us both insane. Robin and I are both a little mad by Earth's standards. And when I die, and I will die first, what then? At that moment Helen would have given her life to believe in his old dream of strange people in the wood. She flung her book restlessly away, and Robin, as if waiting for that signal, sat upright and said almost eagerly, "Helen." Grateful that he had broken the silence of days, she gave him an encouraging smile. "I've been reading your books," he began, diffidently, "and I read about the sun you came from. It's different from this one. Suppose if there were actually a kind of people here, and something in this light, or in your eyes, made them invisible to you." Helen said, "Have you been seeing them again?" He flinched at her ironical tone, and she asked somewhat more gently, "It's a theory, Robin, but it wouldn't explain, then, why you see them." "Maybe I'm more used to this light," he said gropingly. "And anyway, you said you thought you'd seen them and thought it was only a dream." Halfway between exasperation and a deep pity, Helen found herself arguing. "If these other people of yours really exist, why haven't they made themselves known in 16 years? The eagerness with which he answered was almost frightening. "I think they only come out at night. They're what your book calls a primitive civilization." He spoke the words he had read, but never heard, with an odd hesitation. "They're not really a civilization at all, I think. They're like part of the woods." "A forest people," Helen mused, impressed in spite of herself. "And nocturnal. It's always moonlight or dusky when you see them." "Then you do believe me? Oh, Helen!" Robin cried, and suddenly found himself pouring out the story of what he had seen in incoherent words, concluding, "And by daylight I can hear them, but I can't see them. Helen, Helen, you have to believe it now. You have to let me try to find them and learn to talk to them." Helen listened with a sinking heart. She knew they should not discuss it now, when 5 days of enforced housebound proximity had set their nerves and tempers on edge. But some unknown tension hurled her sharp words at Robin. "You saw a woman, and I, a man. These things are only dreams. Do I have to explain more to you?" Robin flung his knife suddenly aside. "You're so blind, so stubborn." "I think you are feverish again." Helen rose to go. He said wrathfully, "You treat me like a child." "Because you act like one, with your fairy tales of women in the wind." Suddenly Robin's agony overflowed, and he caught at her, holding her around the knees, clinging to her as he had not done since he was a small child, his words stumbling and rushing over one another. "Helen, Helen, darling, don't be angry with me," he begged, and caught her in a blind embrace that pulled her off her feet. She had never guessed how strong he was, but he seemed very like a little boy, and she hugged him quickly as he began to cover her face with childish kisses. "Don't cry, Robin, my baby, it's all right," she murmured, kneeling close to him. Gradually, the wildness of his passionate crying abated. She touched his forehead with her cheek to see if it were heated with fever, and he reached up and held her there. Helen let him lie against her shoulder, feeling that perhaps, after the violence of his outburst, he should fall asleep, and she was half asleep herself when a sudden shock of realization darted through her. Quickly she tried to free herself from Robin's entangling arms. "Robin, let me go!" He clung to her, not understanding. "Don't let go of me, Helen, darling. Stay here beside me," he begged, and pressed a kiss into her throat. Helen, her blood icing over, realized that unless she freed herself very quickly now, she would be fighting against a strong, aroused young man, not clearly aware of what he was doing. She took refuge in the sharp maternal note of 10 years ago, almost vanished in the closer, more equal companionship of the time between. "No, Robin, stop it at once. Do you hear?" Automatically he let her go, and she rolled quickly away out of his reach and got to her feet. Robin, too intelligent to be unaware of her anger and too naive to know its cause, suddenly dropped his head and wept, wholly unstrung. "Why are you angry?" he blurted out. "I was only loving you." And at the phrase of the 5-year-old child, Helen felt her throat would burst with its ache. She managed to choke out, "I'm not angry, Robin. We'll talk about this later, I promise." And then, her old control vanishing, turned and fled precipitately into the pouring rain. She plunged through the familiar woods for a long time, in a daze of unthinking misery. She did not even fully realize that she was sobbing and muttering aloud, "No, no, no, no." She must have wandered for several hours. The rain had stopped, and the darkness was lifting before she began to grow calmer and to think more clearly. She had been blind, not to foresee this day when Robin was a child. Only if a child had been a daughter could it have been avoided. Or she was shocked at the hysterical sound of her own laughter. If Colin had stayed, and they had raised a family like Adam and Eve. But what now? Robin was 16. She was not yet 40. Helen caught at vanishing memories of society, taboos so deeply rooted that for Helen they were instinctual and impregnable. Yet for Robin, nothing existed except this little patch of forest and Helen herself, the only person in his world, more specifically at the moment, the only woman in his world. So much, she thought bitterly, for instinct. But have I the right to begin this all over again? Worse, have I the right to deny its existence, and when I die, leave Robin alone? She had stumbled and paused for breath, realizing that she had wandered in circles, and that she was at a familiar point on the riverbank, which she had avoided for 16 years. On the heels of this realization, she had become aware that the only second time in memory, the winds were wholly stilled. Her eyes, swollen with crying, ached as she tried to pierce the gloom of the mist, lilac-tinted, with the approaching sunrise which hung around the water. Through the dispersing mist she made out, dimly, the form of a man. He was tall, and his pale skin shone with misty white colours. Helen sat frozen, her mouth open, and for the space of several seconds he looked down at her without moving. His eyes, dark splashes in the pale face, had an air of infinite sadness and compassion, and she thought his lips moved in speech, but she heard only a thin familiar rustle of wind. Behind him, mere flickers, she seemed to make out the ghosts of other faces, tips of fingers of invisible hands, eyes, the outline of a woman's breast, the curve of a child's foot. For a minute, in Helen's weary, numbed state, all her defences went down, and she thought, "Then I'm not mad, and it wasn't a dream, and Robin isn't Reynolds' son at all. His father was this, one of these, and they've been watching me and Robin. Robin has seen them. He doesn't know he's one of them, but they know. They know, and I've kept Robin from them all these 16 years.
The man took 2 steps toward her, the translucent body shifting to a dozen colors before her blurred eyes. His face had a curious familiarity. Familiarity! And in a sudden spasm of terror, Helen thought, "I'm going mad! It's Robin! It's Robin!" His hand was actually outstretched but to touch her when her scream cut icy lashes through the forest, stirring wild echoes in the wind voices, and she whirled and ran blindly toward the treacherous crumbling bank. Behind her came steps, a voice, a cry. Robin, the strange dryad man, she could not guess. The horror of incest, the son, the father, the lover suddenly melting into one, overwhelmed her reeling brain, and she fled insanely to the brink. She felt a masculine hand actually gripping her shoulder. She might have been pulled back even then, but she twisted free blindly, shrieking, "No, Robin, no, no!" and flung herself down the steep bank, to slip and hurl downward and whirl around in the raging current to spinning oblivion and death. Many years later, Merrihew, grown old in the space service, falsified a log entry to send his ship for a little while into the orbit of the tiny green planet he had named Robin's World. The old buildings had fallen into rotted timbers, and Merrihew quartered the little world for 2 months from pole to pole, but found nothing. Nothing but shadows and whispers and the unending voices of the wind. Finally, he lifted his ship and went away.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. If you like this sort of human read narration, please consider becoming a member of the channel. Members not only get rid of some of their unwanted money, but also may access the stories a whole week before everyone else. And that's it, really. Oh yes, the stories are and will remain AI free. And free of charge, of course.